Welcome, and thank you for joining the Sleep Haunt. Settle in, let the lights fall softly, and allow the quiet of the room to gather around you. Old hospitals never rest fully. Their walls hold the pulse of days long gone, and their corridors breathe in rhythms left behind. Elevators wait in silence, dreaming of floors that no longer exist, while stairwells remember the weight of footsteps that never return. Tonight, you will hear 9 true accounts from these forgotten places. Each one is a small lantern lifted in the dark. Some corridors still smell faintly of medicine and clean linen, while others are painted with warmth that time has gently worn away. Stay with them, because the echoes grow clearer the deeper the path leads, and early details will return like whispers at the end. Rest easily, breathe slowly, and if the house around you groans or settles, let it. That's only wood remembering it was once a tree, and these stories remembering they were once nights. Story number 1. Before the town decided to level Hawthorne Hill Hospital, an archivist was asked to make a last, careful inventory. Her name was Lena, quiet and patient by temperament, with a way of touching old paper as if it were skin. It slowed her, made her attentive. She arrived at the base of the hill near sundown, the building a pale shape above the trees, its windows reflecting a sky the color of dry steel. The grounds were fenced, the padlock newly bright against rusted chain. She had a key from the municipal office, a canvas satchel full of acid-free sleeves, and a thermos that made her feel organized. There was no electricity on the property, not in the modern sense, though the emergency lights were rumored to glow for a minute or two when the wind pressed the battered doors. The rumor made no mechanical sense, but she'd heard it from 3 different contractors, and they'd all said it the same way, as a fact with a shrug, something to nod at and move past. Inside, the foyer smelled like dust, violets, and the ghost of disinfectant. The reception desk curved like a smile that never committed. Someone had left a clock on the wall even after the last staff left. It held both arms at 2:17. Her footsteps made a careful sound there, the kind of sound a librarian makes when checking on sleeping stacks. The building heard her and replied only with settling. Lena took a slow route. She liked beginnings, and buildings have their own ways of introducing themselves. Off the foyer, a corridor wore a row of framed black and white photographs of staff holiday parties, each face clear enough to feel like an introduction. The caption said, Hawthorne Hill Convalescent, 1958, and Holiday Social, 1972. There was a line of punch bowls, a paper garland drooping slightly, and a uniformed man with a tambourine leaning into a laugh that had no sound left. It was human and gentle. The harsh things had gone away with the machines. Her task was simple. Carry out the patient ledgers, the staff schedule books, any notices posted near doors, some original signage for the local museum. She had promised herself she wouldn't go through the whole building, just the administrative level and records, then leave before the blank parts of night could settle in the stairwells. She set her thermos on the reception desk and began. At the end of the first corridor, a wall map waited behind glass, the kind with a red dot that announces, "You are here." It was an older plan, with wings labeled for purposes no longer practiced the same way. Convalescence, isolation, maternity. The red dot sat right where she stood. It amused her that the map remained true. She paused for a second to note the design. When she moved on and glanced back, she only thought she saw the red dot slide a finger's width to the right. It wasn't that it moved in front of her. It was that her brain carried the feeling of being watched by the dot instead of the other way around. She let it pass and lifted the latch of the records room. The doors opened on air that hadn't moved much in decades. Banked shelves stretched away into dimness, each metal frame steady with ring binders and narrow boxes labeled with years. She turned on her headlamp and met 1,000 paper spines. It was simple work, honest and clean. She lifted a ledger, pressed its spine flat, read the neat cursive, sighed at the tidy repetition of days. In the quiet, the building made its soft shifts and pops, and very occasionally something light ticked like a distant metronome. She thought it might be a drip counting down from a pipe that no longer had water to offer. An intercom speaker stared from near the ceiling, its grilled face turned to the door. She made a note to document that, too. The museum liked fixtures that suggested communication. She imagined the clicks that had once prefaced announcements. When the speaker gave a microscopic crackle, A very small, very calm, pop-like static thinking about forming words. She held still and waited. There was no voice, only a breath of white noise, and the crisp quiet afterward. She smiled at her own attention and filled a box with careful ease. Hour by hour, if there were hours in a place where the clock would not move, Lena worked down the list. She set aside a stack of laminated staff ID cards, each portrait a little square of a person mid-laugh, mid-sigh, mid-trying to smile for a camera at the end of a long shift. She bagged them to return later. A child's drawing pinned at the end of a shelf made her pause. A field of blue marker with a yellow sun that had 9 rays, 1 bent. The paper had curled at the edges, but the tape held stubbornly. The name in crayon at the bottom had been blurred by time until it was only suggestion. The blue felt familiar in the odd way that all bright, simple colors do when found where they shouldn't be. When she left the records room to bring the first box to the door, the hallway seemed longer by 3 steps. The light from the foyer reached only so far, a small promise that didn't quite arrive at her feet. She slowed to match the way the building breathed. A cart sat under the wall map now, a wooden thing with squeaky wheels and a handwritten sign on the handle that said, "Return to Biomed." It hadn't been there before. It was exactly the sort of thing a previous crew might have left in a hurry. She set the box on it and pushed, and its wheels gave a mild protest before agreeing. The red dot on the map faced her steadily. She nodded to it, as to a helpful clerk, and moved along. In the reception area, she took a moment to sit on the corner of the front desk and drink from the thermos. Outside, cicadas whirred. Inside, the air had that coolness that finds bones, even on warm nights. The guest chair nearest the door was upholstered in a cheerful fabric scattered with small shapes that, seen from a distance, were leaves. Up close, they became tiny hands, open and offering. She found that sweet, then let the thought sink like a leaf and return to the surface in a different color. The second trip into the records room set small things askew. A binder she'd left on the left was on the right. A pencil she'd set behind her ear wasn't behind her ear anymore, but standing like a thin monument in the groove of the desk. Her satchel lay open in exactly the position she had left it, except for a soft bump beneath its top flap. She lifted the fabric and found a strip of stiff paper, an old-style hospital bracelet, the kind that closes with a snap. It was blank. There was a space for name, a space for the date. The plastic had yellowed the way old tape does. She replaced it gently, like someone tucking a child's scarf back into a drawer they weren't supposed to reach. Work, she told her mind. Museums like ephemera. In the breath just after that thought, the intercom clicked again. This time, the white noise drew long enough to feel like someone thinking carefully. Then a tone rose, gentle and clear, as a Padia D. Tuning fork struck lightly. It lasted a blink. She looked up. The air resumed its usual quiet. Down the hall, the elevator doors were ajar by a thumb's width, as if something narrow had pressed between them and then changed its mind. Elevators rely on building power. There shouldn't have been any movement in those doors. She tested the call button for curiosity's sake. It didn't light. The elevator itself gave a small sound, a syllable of movement without function, like a person shifting in sleep. She backed away only so the doors could decide without her attention. On her third trip, she passed a row of wheelchairs leaned neatly against a wall, their footrests arranged like folded wings. They weren't there before, not in that precise row, not facing that blank section of paint that had been touched up 5 times in 5 different whites. No one likes to admit to moving furniture in an empty building without remembering doing it. She patted one chair's handle in the way people pat a good dog when they don't know what else to say. In the nurse's station, she found a drawer that resisted. It opened finally with a small sigh. Inside lay a scatter of Polaroids, nothing wild, nothing forbidden. Mostly cakes on rolling carts, a cardboard sign reading, "Good luck, Lillian." A snapshot of a hallway decorated with paper snowflakes while the sun blazed in the windows. One photo didn't belong, and that was only because it had no image. It was gray from corner to corner, a fog locked behind gloss. Someone had written a date on the white border. The year matched the year of the bent sun's crayon drawing. Tina, in charge of the museum, would be charmed by how these things cross each other if they are invited to. All the while, the hospital followed the one rule that old buildings honor. If something wonders whether it is being watched, it island. At the end of an hour that might have been more, Lena noticed that when she moved down the hall, The red dot on the map did not remain faithfully anchored. She didn't see it slide. She only noticed it had slid when she returned and stood again where she had been. The dot knew where here was, and here had developed an opinion about her. The wind rose outside and dropped. A window at the far end of the corridor shivered a chain of small rattles. In that pause, something soft crossed behind her, like a line cast across a pond. A filament of sound drew through the intercom. A little ascending beep, the universal call that once meant, look up, listen. It blossomed into a voice that wasn't a voice so much as the idea of a voice. The words weren't words, but a set of syllables shaped into her name with all the vowels removed. Lun. She didn't run. She stood as if while doing so she might not startle the air. After a while, because work is the one good antidote to fear, she resumed. The ledgers got heavier, or she got slower. On the 7th trip, she found a narrow metal bed in a small room near the stairwell. The mattress had been removed. The frame held a blanket folded in the crisp way that people in uniforms do. The pillow's indent was a careful hollow, not from weight, but from hands pressing. A pair of slippers rested beneath the bed, their toes turned slightly toward each other, innocently, as if in conversation. In a silly impulse, she straightened the slippers together and felt absurdly that something thanked her for correcting it. She found the operating theater with its high windows and drafty dignity. Dust makes a room honest because it exposes where air moves, and the air in that room moved in slow circles. A clock high on the wall held to a minute that didn't exist. She felt watched not by malice but by a location. A place can learn a set of gestures. The building wanted to tuck her in. The thought comforted and unsettled at once. When she went back for her thermos, it was sitting on the reception counter where she had left it, only now a ring of moisture circled its base on otherwise dry laminate, as if she had just picked it up a moment before. The thermos was cool. The ring should have evaporated. She touched the edge. It broke cleanly like a line a ruler had made on ocean. As she turned, something in the corner of her sight suggested movement. The wheelchairs in the row had pivoted a few inches. Their front casters angled now toward the corridor instead of the painted wall. It could have been the slope of the floor. It could have been breath moving through the building and moving it in turn. If she edged her toe under a wheel and lifted lightly, the chair hummed a tiny song and settled again. But it had not been her. She did not say her name in her head the way people do when they remind themselves they exist. She let the room name her. By the time she had packed the last of the ledgers she needed, the world outside had gone completely to night, and the building found a deeper stillness. She decided to walk the main hall once, from the front doors to the end of the wing with the mural of a tree painted on cinder block, then back. It's good to say good night to a place that's invited you in. The elevator doors were open a handspan now, and a faint blue glow sat inside the car. The floor indicator above the doors displayed a number that didn't belong to any floor. 2 small bars that sometimes mean pause, sometimes mean no. She stood in front of the opening and looked at her reflection in the brushed steel. Her headlamp painted a ring of light around her face. The intercom tone bloomed one more time, gentle, patient. "Thank you," she said out loud, breaking her own rule about not being part of a place. The word left her mouth like something that had always been waiting. On the way back, she passed the map again. The red dot had traveled. It was at the end of the corridor, near the mural now, quite simple about it, as if it had never been anywhere else. A different, smaller dot had appeared behind it, as if showing the previous route. The inscription beneath was older than everything around it, and written in neat, narrow print. "You are here. We are here." It could have been a prank, an old staff in-joke, something someone wrote before the building was mothballed. She liked the thought that a tired nurse with neat handwriting had added that to make a bright-eyed intern smile. She loaded the last box onto the cart and rolled toward the front doors. When the cart crossed the entryway, a motion sensor clicked, and the vestibule light came on with a soft-hearted glow, as if it had been waiting for someone to leave. She almost laughed, half from relief, half from the simple kindness of a light understanding its job after so many seasons of sleep. At the threshold, she paused. A clipboard leaned against the wall to the right. The way people leave something where their hand will remember it on the way out. The top sheet was an intake list. Most entries were decades old. The last line had today's date, written in the same narrow print as the map's neat edition. Name: Lena Sims. Reason for admission: Archive. Anticipated discharge: Dawn. Someone with a pen had drawn a tidy checkbox beside discharged and left it empty. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anything more than a way of saying that a building can't release what it never held. She lifted the pen because one should close circles when one can, and a small part of her minded the superstition. The ink did not flow. She set the pen back. The box could remain empty. Dawn was coming of its own accord. Outside, crickets worked at their orchestra. The air felt lighter. She locked the chain, and the new padlock folded through the links with an eager click, as if it were satisfied to do its simple job. From the hill she could see, between the trees, the town's river, and the faint glow of the water plant, and the tiny lives moving inside lit windows. There was a bench by the path that remembered a time when families waited there with flowers. She sat for a minute. And the Paran. Silence reached out as gently as a nurse, checking a sleeping child's temperature by palm. Later, when she came back to the municipal office with boxes that smelled like cedar and dust and patience, the night clerk asked how it went. Lena answered with the truth. A person can say to another, without making it a story, boxes, ledgers, old signs, a kindly oddness you get from places that held a routine long enough to attract habits of meaning. The night clerk nodded and said the demolition crew would start by the end of the week. She handed over the intake forms, the Polaroids, the staff IDs, the laminated cafeteria menu of a Thursday in 1971 offering meatloaf or baked fish, the bent sun drawing, the gray photo, and the blank bracelet. The clerk looked at the bracelet and rolled it between fingers. A faint impression had risen where the blank had been. Not ink, not pencil, just pressure, suggesting letters. The light made it a whisper, but both saw it the same way, and both took a step closer to the desk to read. It said only one word. Not hers, not anyone's. Admitted. The bracelet was old. Ink can bleed from things stacked on top. Pressure can push a ghost of letters into plastic. They both knew a natural reason existed. Then they moved on to the next item, because cataloging is a way to say goodnight to a thing. That night at home, Lena woke once to the smallest noise, the tender crackle of an intercom testing itself. It was the refrigerator fan cycling. She put her hand on the wall and felt nothing but a modern building behaving. In the morning, she found a red sticker on her satchel. The museum sometimes used red dots to mark items on display. This one was unremarkable. A circle the size of a fingertip. She smiled at the coincidence and left it there. At demolition, one of the crew took a photo of the wall map because he liked the way lines tell a story without moving. He sent it to the local paper. When the picture printed, the caption noted the faded routes and the charming old typography, and someone called in to say they recognized the handwriting that had added, "We are here." It belonged to a nurse named Lillian, the same one from the cake in the Polaroid. She had been a person who tidied shoes and checked on sleeping rooms, and kept a light on a little longer if anyone seemed lonely. People like that make a building a kind of home, even when it is an institution designed for patience and long days. The museum displayed the wall map, the bracelet, and the bent sun drawing in a small glass case with soft lighting. Children pressed their noses to the glass and tried to line up their own fingertips with the red dot. Their parents read the plaque and thought for a moment about how the word care can be a job and a feeling at once. On the nights when the museum closed and the lights dimmed, a motion sensor near the case sometimes recorded a tiny blip at 2:17 in the morning. The guard reviewed the footage and found nothing to worry about, only the way air moves when buildings think gently. As for Lena, she sometimes walked by Hawthorne Hill's former lot, now a field of flattened earth where wildflowers were trying to tie their roots together. She still carried a satchel, though a different one. She kept her thermos and her habits. When the wind lifted, the sound of a distant tone sometimes rose with it, and she thought of a red dot that always knows where here, Island, a place can be admitted into a life too, and discharged, with gratitude, at dawn. Story number 2. Seacliff Mercy was the sort of hospital that always looked like it was at low tide. The building sat above the harbor on a bluff, its windows facing a line of docks and a radio tower beyond. The day it closed, a nor'easter had blown through and pressed water up against the seawall. A few years later, fences went up. A sign announced redevelopment someday, and gulls took over the roofline like an impatient choir. Inside, everything waited in the shade. Paper curled, paint sighed. Even the clocks seemed to rest their shoulders. Milo came because he was good at listening to rooms. The Historical Society had asked for a sound portrait before the walls came down. He loved that phrase, sound portrait. It sounded like a kindness. He packed small microphones, a pair of contact pickups, a case for a parabolic dish, and a little recorder that ran all night without complaint. He liked the way gear had preferences, as if each machine understood a different kind of silence. He parked on the service drive below the ambulance port and walked in with a key that didn't want to forget how to work. The door yielded with the soft clunk of a good hinge. The lobby was cool and blue in the way of big rooms on hot evenings. A fish tank still stood against one wall, empty, its gravel pale as bones of shells. The gift shop was shuttered, a rack of postcards slumped against the glass. He turned off his phone in a gesture of politeness. The last daylight slanted through the salt-fogged windows and painted the floor in stripes. Somewhere below, the harbor made a rope-on-wood noise that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with staying. He started with the pediatric wing because a museum volunteer had said the murals were still pretty. A whale rode a wave on one wall, 2 children in yellow coats waving from the crest, and a lighthouse threw a painted beam across the door. The colors were still bright in the halting light, as if the room remembered how to be cheerful and could look that way on command. He set one microphone on a rolling tray and clipped another to the baseboard, the way he'd learned to do to hear the voices of pipes. The air returned his attention with the dry whisper of paper. He listened in his headphones and heard a long, slow breath that was really wind finding a seam. Down the hall, a pneumatic tube station sat like a small altar to messages. The system had been quiet for decades, but the tubes still had their clear elbows, the capsules still had their braided grips. He put a contact mic on the station's steel column, and the metal returned a soft hum like a coin, thinking. He liked that. He liked the sound of infrastructure, remembering that it used to be a route for sentences. He took a walk to set up a long corridor capture. Big rooms need time to find their voices. The surgery level had lantern skylights and rows of doors with small portholes. He set a pair of pickups on a gurney rail, then stilled himself until he could hear his own heartbeat, not because he wanted it on the recording, but to know where not to stand. His eyes adjusted to the drafty mid-blue of the late hour. The exit signs breathed their own faint glow, photoluminescent paint that had learned to hold light in its skin and give it back slowly. The first sound came from the tube system. Headphones on, he heard the unmistakable hollow whoop of air moving, then another, as if an invisible hand had let a message slide. He pulled the mic aside and listened with just the room. A capsule thumped into the cradle. It was almost funny, the way an obsolete machine behaved according to its old habits as soon as an audience arrived. He opened the door and found the capsule waiting. Inside lay a piece of index card stamped in purple. The ink faded to lavender. The words were simple. Quiet hours, 9 p.m. He looked at his watch. 8:58. It was an old policy, the kind that lives on a poster beside a smiling clock. He propped the card on the lip of the station, as if not to pocket something that didn't belong to him. 9 came quietly, as befits quiet hours. Outside, the harbor horn lifted a low note and lowered it again. Down the main corridor, a hanging sign pointed toward a chapel he hadn't noticed on the map. He liked the idea of a room designed for hush, so he went exploring with the parabolic dish cased in his arms like a portable moon. The chapel was narrow, with 2 rows of pews and tall panes of glass colored like the harbor at different times of day. The stained windows showed a boat, a sheaf of wheat, a hand releasing a bird. There was an organ at the back, its pipes like a small metal forest. He touched the keys gently with one fingertip. There was no sound, but wood always knows when it's acknowledged. He set a contact mic on the organ's lowest pipe and pressed record. The pipe returned nothing at first, and then a faint tone rose out of it, so soft he wasn't sure if it was in the organ or only in the room. It was not a note so much as the thought of a note. The room was breathing again. That was all. He smiled into his collar and let the recorder work. He'd learned that forcing a sound never gave the right shape. The room had to offer it. Back in the pediatric wing, the tone had deepened. The little microphones translated the building into a patient sea of air and dust. The whale on the wall seemed to lean more into its painted wave, though that was only the way shadows cooperate with suggestion. The curtain around a tiny bed frame moved without a draft, just the smallest sway like a nod. In his headphones, something began to click at measured intervals, a soft tick the exact length of a nurse's glance. He traced it to a ceiling vent, and then to the heating core beyond the wall. Old metal remembers the rhythms of a place. When schedules live long enough, even the radiators learn them. He set his tone generator to a low sweep and let it rise slowly, barely above the room's own breath. He liked to do this to find the resonant hum of a building, to see where its bones answered. At a certain pitch, the length of the hallway answered back, just once, like a bowl singing. In the moment after that, the click from the vent stopped, and a hush fell so complete it sounded like a note. He cut the generator and waited. A faint whoomp traveled the tube line again, and another capsule nicked the cradle. He opened it. Another card in the same purple bruised ink. "Thank you," he laughed under his breath. Old Staff had had a sense of humor. He walked the surgical corridor again, this time slower, rolling the parabolic dish along on its handle like a suitcase. The dish gathered the distant and made it close. A drip in the stairwell that had no water. The sigh of a door where no one had passed. A shoe squeak that was really a window adjusting to night. The elevator lobby sat in a square of shadow, its display dark and dignified. He placed a contact mic on the side of the car, and a second on the rail of the lobby chair next to it. Through the headphones, he heard a deep, steady hum. Not motion, not the motor that would require power. The building itself had a frequency, a tone of having been useful a long time. Sometimes a structure holds that the way a violin holds music after a bow has left the string. He stayed until the hum rose a little, as if the tone generator earlier had suggested a conversation, and the elevator was thinking of an answer. The floor indicator above the doors flickered once, not on, exactly, more like a memory of on. It held for a count of 3 and then settled into stillness. Milo said thank you out loud without meaning to make a ritual out of it, just because gratitude makes rooms feel less like tests. The maintenance stairs didn't love him the way stairs sometimes do. They had been practical a long time, and wanted to be left alone. He went anyway, down to a level where the concrete felt damp, because the bluff held the ocean close even when it didn't spill. The air there had a green cold to it. He unclipped his hydrophone and lowered it into a shallow film of water that had gathered in a trench along the wall. He didn't expect music. He expected the plain version of sound. Droplets, a little hum from somewhere far away, the rumor that mice carry. What came up the cable was a lull, then a thread of clear tone, barely there, steady enough to make a person's chest loosen. The microphone translated physical quiet into something like a song. He tracked the resonance to a door with a metal sign. Quiet room. The word had been chosen long ago for reasons as layered as paint. He touched the handle and then let go. Not because of fear, but because not every door wants to be opened by the first hand that tries it. He set the parabolic dish down and listened with his human ears. Somewhere above, a cartwheel moved exactly 1 revolution, then stopped. The hydrophone whispered river syllables. The building held itself like a breath. Time lifted and lowered itself the way harbor fog does. He climbed back up because he wanted to check the recordings. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It felt right to see what the room had offered. In the chapel, the organ pipe he'd mic'd had begun to speak in a faint, repeating interval. It was so soft, he could have mistaken it for the sound of distant traffic, except the rhythm was too careful. It moved in a pattern reminiscent of a lullaby, without being 1-4 short pulses, a pause, then a long, round tone that made his fingers uncurl. He let it go. If music was going to happen, it needed a listener more than a maker. He made the circuit again. Pediatric, surgery, lobby, stair, basement, chapel. Each place developed its own vocabulary. The pediatric wing stitched clicks and gentle sways into a hush. The surgery corridor stretched hum into line. The elevator listened back. The basement whispered up its underwater vowel. The chapel made the air hold a chord it didn't know it had lungs for. The hospital behaved like a choir with someone's hand raised where a baton should be. Past midnight, a sudden wind approached, shook the water outside into a louder arrangement, and went away. In that fat minute, A ripple of motion traveled the building in small acts. A curtain's whisper, a paper roll tightening on its spindle, a door closer giving a click like a distant metronome. He watched as the pneumatic tube station set one more capsule into its cradle. He took his time opening it. This card wasn't purple ink official. It was lined paper torn carefully and folded twice. In tidy, careful handwriting, someone had written, "Visitors welcome at 10. Rest now." He sat in the lobby chair with its squeaky rail and looked at the gift shop's ghostly postcards. He set his recorder on the counter because it felt like the sort of place where someone would set down keys, a pen, a listening device. Rest now. It didn't feel like an order. It felt like an offer. He closed his eyes and let the hospital be what it had been built to be. The building knew how to hold quiet. There is an old skill in places that for years required gentle talk, measured steps, voices pitched to make rest possible. He didn't sleep. He drifted the way sound does when it isn't being asked to mean more than itself. When he opened his eyes, the exit signs looked a little less green and a little more like glowworms that happened to know their job. On his way back to gather the hydrophone, he passed a wall of staff photos. Most frames had been moved elsewhere, leaving behind pale rectangles, but a few lingered. He recognized the face of a man from a decades-old newspaper clipping about the hospital's opening. He had the optimistic smile of a person who loves handing out clipboards. Someone had put a sticker on the frame's glass, a simple red dot, probably from the Historical Society's last visit. It made the man look already selected, already part of a collection of memory. Milo liked that small intention. He lifted the hydrophone from its shallow pool. On the tape, the gentle tone had held steady. A second tone had joined it at a lower place, so low it was more shape than sound. Together they braided into something like a held hand. He clipped the pickups and wound away his cables, gentle with the ends like a person winding thread from a family spindle. The building watched without eyes and did what it had practiced for half a century. It held. At the elevator, the out-of-order plaque had been tilted. He nudged it back to level. The floor indicator above the doors showed nothing, then flickered one dash, then another, then nothing again. He raised a hand in the almost salute people give to machines that have tried. In the pediatric wing, the whale seemed to look past him toward the hallway, which was only the trick of mural eyes whose pupils follow the longest line. He swept the room once with the dish, and heard the kind of silence that comes when a story remembers its last line, but waits to see if anyone else wants to tell it. He left when the harbor decided to imagine morning. Gulls tilted over the bluff. The tower blinked. He locked the door and listened from the outside, because outside has its own ear. The hospital was quiet in the way a sleeper is when their dreams are good. He packed the gear, put the case in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat with the recorder in his hands. The first playthrough was always like developing a photograph. Picture and sound share that slow reveal. The recordings were better than he had hoped. The pediatric wing gave a steady breath punctuated by a friendly tick. The surgical corridor offered a tone like a line drawn with a soft pencil. The elevator voiced a stable hum whose peaks rose and fell in patient waves. The hydrophone had captured a lull that turned water into instrument. The organ pipe held its not-quite song, patient, unhungry, tender. He smiled at the simple accuracy of things that do what they do well. When he moved the tracks into his editing program that night, he saw something he wouldn't have known to notice if he hadn't spent years looking at the shape of sound. The long files, plotted together in their different colors, made a pattern that wasn't random. It wasn't a heart tracing. It wasn't a map. It was a timetable's soft cousin. Every few minutes, each recorded track lifted a little at the same time. Click aligned with hum, aligned with chord, aligned with water-like stations, calling each other to attention. It looked like a set of gentle bells arranged on a shelf by height. He leaned in. At certain intervals, tiny peaks appeared in the organ track that matched slight dips in the elevator hum. There was conversation between them, or at least cooperation, as if the building had remembered what shift change felt like and decided to honor it one more time, cleanly, sweetly. He built the piece with the daylight of morning on his hands. He named it The Night Voice of Mercy, because the joke of it that mercy can be a place and a quality pleased him. He sent a cut to the Historical Society. They sent back 3 exclamation points and $1,000 thank you tucked into a very proper email. The museum asked if they could play the piece in a small room off their maritime exhibit. He said yes, and brought them a little speaker that looks like a stone. He positioned it so that if a person leaned against the wall to tie a child's shoe, they would feel the low hum in their shoulder blade without knowing why it felt like standing on a ferry. The museum put up a small sign that said, put simply, "Room tone from Seacliff Mercy, recorded June 12, 20. The sign had a second line beneath it. Quiet hours begin at 9. People smiled. Some took photos of the speaker because taking photos of a sound made them happy. In the evenings, after the museum closed and the lights stepped down, a security camera in that small room sometimes caught a flicker of reflection on the glass of a nearby case, as if a person had passed and then politely turned to go. When the guard checked, there was no one. The air was the sort of cool that encourages good sleep. The low hum made the room feel larger than it was. Milo went back once at noon to return the key. He parked again beneath the ambulance port for the memory of it, and stood for a moment, looking at the roofline, at the gulls, at the harbor that shrugged, and kept on. He thought about the simple instruction in that lavender ink quiet hours 9 p.m., and how following it had made the building his accomplice rather than his test. He thought about how many nights that sentence had softened the hospital's edges, how many voices had let themselves lower when they saw it, how that small discipline of hush had saved rest for anyone who needed it. He kept the capsule cards he'd been asked to take as artifacts with the recordings filed in their case. The cards weren't haunted. They were just old paper with old letters. But sometimes, very late, when he played back the lobby's gentle hush for himself because the world was loud, a soft whoomp would rise in the track just before the organ found its tone, and he would put the cards on his desk beside the recorder like a pair of listening hands. Weeks later, when the first machines nosedived into the old walls, neighbors said the noise of demolition was less harsh than they expected, as if the building itself was practicing good manners on the way out. The day the chapel went, a photograph caught the art glass bird flying in the sun in the second before the pane met air. It made the paper. People kept it on their refrigerators like a kind of blessing. In the museum, the room with the speaker filled in the afternoons with older people who rested on the bench and teenagers who lay on the carpet, and a few infants who fell asleep on shoulders when the low hum began its shy song. For as long as the piece played, Seacliff Mercy went on having quiet hours, and the quiet had shape enough to be shared. Milo's favorite part of the final mix was a small thing most people did not notice. 3 minutes in, there was a muted click in the high left of the stereo image. If he had lined it up right, and he had, 5 minutes later, another muted click answered from the low right. It was nothing more than metal remembering a nurse's check, a door closer finishing its thought, a message moving from station to station in a place designed to keep people company while they rested. If a person listened to the whole piece, at the end, those 2 faint clicks met like a pair of hands closing softly over a blanket. No one needed to know it was intentional. It had always been the building's idea. Story number 3. Summit Vale Infirmary had been built for air. It sat on a spine of granite above the timberline, all long windows and south-facing galleries, a place where the sun was invited to be a nurse. A century earlier, fresh light and thin winds had been prescribed like medicine. The place thrived on it. When the last wing closed, the mountain kept the keys. Snow pressed its shoulder against the eastern doors in winter. In summer, dry lightning stitched the sky and left the roof singing. People said the building exhaled at dusk, the way a sleeping thing does. It was meant to teach lungs how to be brave. Orla came because tall places and old plans were her work. The county wanted a structural survey ahead of a proposed conversion residences with terraces, a small library where the solarium once lived, a climbing wall where the dumbwaiters had been. She brought a tripod laser scanner, a backpack with LiDAR and reflective spheres, a meter wheel on a handle, and a coil of chalk line. It felt companionable to have tools that liked to measure. She parked below a long overhang where ambulances once kissed the curb, and her boots found grit and old salt in the seams. The lobby gives a place away in a second. This one was a stone floor cathedral, with a mosaic of a sunrise, where a rug might have gone. Pine scent clung to the air as if someone had opened a box of eucalyptus cough drops and walked out, leaving the ghost of sweetness behind. A wooden sign behind the desk announced visiting hours. The numbers softened by time, until they looked like they were trying to sit down. A stair swept up to a mezzanine lined with wicker loungers. Someone had left a wool blanket folded on one. Neat as a sentence that ends correctly. Her first pass was all logistics. She set a sphere at the corner of the admissions desk, one more under the balcony, one near the elevator bank. The scanner whirred as it turned, painting the room with invisible threads and reading its own echo back. Orla liked the mental picture of that. The room measured for a suit it would never wear. On her tablet, the point cloud arrived in dots, columns, rails, the sweep of stair, the long mouth of a hallway opening toward the solarium wing. A rectangular smudge sat near the front doors, a place where the scanner's beam had been eaten cleanly. She looked up. A flyer board from decades ago still hung there with empty pushpins like constellations. The smudge matched it in shape as if paper removed left an outline in air. She chalked grid lines along the lobby floor, small marks at regular intervals, the way surveyors tame dimensions into a walking rhythm. A soft draft slid along the floor and lifted one line of chalk into a pale cloud that settled again in a straighter version than she had drawn. She smiled because the building had corrected her as if it wanted neatness. Snowmelt somewhere far inside ticked at a frequency that tried to pass for a clock. She wrote it off as pipes expressing themselves and went on. On the solarium level, glass wrapped the world. The room faced south like a row of faces turned toward a story. Iron plant stands without plants lined the windows in an orderly defiance of emptiness. A wooden sign on a stand reads sunbathing guidelines, things like, "Limit your first day to 5 minutes, and wool blankets are available upon request." The blankets still were, folded in a cupboard with a cedar puck that had dulled to a scent like an old piano. Orla ran the meter wheel along the room, noting where the floor sloped toward drains, where tiles cracked and paused, where the mountain had shrugged against human plans. The scanner set on its tripod blinked a tiny ready light back at her, busy the way a beehive island. She leaned her forehead briefly to the glass and felt its cold say, "We are honest here." Outside, the sky drew a clean line over peaks. Wind wrote its quick cursive in a strip of prayer flags that someone had tied to the railing long ago. A sun louver above her clicked once in a puzzled way and settled. No power ran to motor anything in the building. The click was a mechanical reflex in metal that liked to remember its uses. The infirmary had been built with small kindnesses. Along the corridor, narrow windows beside each room's door allowed the light to travel even when a door was closed. Little brass plates above those windows held numbers stamped in an Art Deco font. She passed 204, 206, 208, and then a plate that read just 2, as if someone had been interrupted halfway through a thought. She marked the oddity on her plan and moved on. The building did not feel ugly or mean. It felt like a polite hotel that woke up and found itself in the wrong century. Near the end of the wing, a sky bridge leapt to a smaller pavilion. The bridge's floor was frosted glass lit from beneath by the bright heat of daylight, so that walking it felt like stepping on shallow milk. Midway, she stopped because pale ovals appeared in the dust ahead, enlarging one after another, as if footsteps were showing themselves without being made. They weren't shaped like shoes. They were softened at the edges the way socks might be if a person padded quietly along. Orla measured one with 2 fingers together, and then measured her own boot print in dust behind her. The sock shapes were shorter than her handspan. The bridge air cooled a notch and warmed again, the way corridors do when doors breathe. She went into radiography because doors left ajar are good invitations. The viewing wall still held a line of light boxes, their square frames expecting film. In a drawer beneath, she found envelopes like slim manila pillows. One held a sheet with a field of fog and a ghost of a spine like a road. She held it to the window's mountain light and watched the bones of another dusk bloom in silver. The sheet changed as she moved it, not in content, but in tone. Here a white that felt like snow, there a gray that felt like stone. She set it back carefully, a person not inviting anyone to follow them home. Down one flight, the hydrotherapy rooms had tiled benches and a wall chart showing breathing exercises. In for 4, hold for 5, out for 6, like stairs in numbers. A small brass bell hung near a door with a placard that read rounds. It had a pull string that had been handled enough to be polished by fingers. Orla did not touch it. She stood still and listened. Air moved over the mouth of the bell and coaxed the smallest sound from it. Not a ring, more a kiss of metal thinking about singing. The meter wheel clacked once against the baseboard and then, subtly, someone else's measure took over. She counted without meaning to. 4 slow breath. like huffs of wind, then a long pause, then a hush. The building had practiced this so often that it could not help but repeat it. At the end of the hall, a door marked roof access had been wedged with a rubber block, so shallow it was more suggestion than wedge. The roof, when she pushed into it, unfolded in tiers and rails and a long line of wooden loungers in pairs. Names had been carved into the arms initials, mostly dates. One small pine tree with an arrow through it like a child fortifying a valentine. The wind was a steady friend up there. She set a sphere on the parapet and watched it steady itself in a small earthquake of air. The scanner's head ticked degree by degree as it gathered the roof and sky. On her tablet, the point cloud painted gull traces and flag threads and the invisible tumble of the wind into an ordered storm of dots. The world was both chaos and grid, and the reconciliation of those two made her heart slow kindly. She had been in the building 3 hours when she first noticed the way the floor numbers refused to obey. The stairwell painted floors 1 through 5 in ascending blocks of cream and green, and yet when she walked down from 3 to 2, the landing wall announced 4 politely in the same hand as the others, convinced of itself. The geometry of heavy places rarely lies, so she checked with the meter wheel and with her arm's count of steps. She was where her notes said she was. The numbers had chosen to be where she wasn't. She took a pencil and drew a small arrow beside the painted 4 pointing to the next landing and wrote, "Try again," as if the building might enjoy the joke. When she returned the same way an hour later, the arrow had been erased with a damp cloth someone had wrung out with disciplined fingers. No smudge remained. The building liked to keep its signs tidy. In the basement, the air smelled like iron and snowmelt and old soap. Laundry carts slept in a line, their canvas still smelling faintly of lemon. A chute door in the wall had a polite sign that said check before placing linens. As she passed, the door tapped itself twice, a knock from the empty. Orla's left hand did what hands do when they are invited to be helpful. It reached, opened, and found nothing but a square of cool darkness and the soft thought of a draft passing. She closed the door and set the latch. It opened on its own with a patience that did not feel like defiance. It felt like muscle memory. She took one long loop through the ward that had been meant for night breezes. The rooms were simple: bed, chair, window, a hook for a robe. In one, a journal lay on the windowsill, the pages bowed by humidity that had come and gone. The entries were from a volunteer who had watered geraniums and fetched blankets. The writing was all small, practical blessings. Mrs. H prefers tea warm, extra sugar. Mr. L likes the sun to his left. Storms are louder when you love someone who is trying to rest. The last line, undated, reads simply, "We will keep the quiet for them." Orla copied it into her field book, without thinking about why the sentence felt like a beam set well. Beyond that wing, the funicular bay hid behind a roll-up door stuck half-raised. The old mountain tram had long ago been pulled from its track. Only cable drums remained, their drums like great spools of thread too heavy for a hand. She stood with the scanner and watched it draw the curves of steel and room and dust into a patient portrait. On the tablet, the point cloud revealed a swoop that wasn't machinery, the outline of a bench seat that shouldn't have been there, as if a carriage waited. When she lowered the tripod to a different height, the seat dematerialized politely, as if she had interrupted a game of pretending. The tablet caught the afterimage as a faint halo of points that refused to commit to furniture. Upstairs again, she met a wall of schedule boards with magnetic strips that once held names. Most were blank. One held a single line: Fresh Air Walk. And after it, an arrow pointing outside. There was no time attached and no name. The arrow had been drawn with a blue pencil common to schools and back offices, the kind with a waxy line. Orla was known among her team for following instructions written down in that hand. She took her jacket and went. The path around the building was a narrow ledge of pavement between retaining wall and sky. Ravens balanced on the air, the way skaters balance on ice. Wind folded and unfolded her shadow across the mountain's face. When she came back inside, the bell near the hydrotherapy sign shaped a single rounded tone like a child, saying a vowel and then feeling proud. She worked until the shadows lengthened into a gentler category. Her scans were good. Her notes read like a hymn. She set the last sphere in the lobby and turned to see what the cloud had made of it. Above the reception desk, the mosaic sunrise looked a little different in points than in stone. The colors were numbers now, In that translation, a new line had appeared, a thin arc of points in the upper right like a bird set into the tile that the naked eye could not see. She climbed the desk and reached with a gloved finger. The arc wasn't there on stone. It lived in the laser's suggestion of the room. It completed a shape that turned the sunrise into a clock without hands. On her way out, she took one more pass along the solarium hall, because some places deserve a second goodbye. The little windows above doors, lit with a pearly daylight without Sunday. Not bright, not strange, only a thickness of glow that looked like a glass of milk in shade. Something changed as she walked, not in the light but in her procession through it. The number plates above the windows, those deco figures that had earlier lost their discipline, had corrected themselves. 204, 206, 208, 210, each with a little dot of green paint beside it, a dot so small that it could only have been placed by a brush with 3 hairs. The dots were fresh, the smell told her. The paint had that soft, new emerald scent. Orla paused at 212 because the door stood ajar in a way that was modest, like a person who wants company but won't ask. Inside, the bed frame was only a rectangle of shadow on the floor. A chair faced the window. The blanket folded at the foot had a label stitched with a name that had been unpicked and then stitched again. On the windowsill, a small object sat under a film of dust. She blew lightly and revealed a glass paperweight with a bubble inside the size of a teardrop. If she tilted it, a thin filament inside caught light and drew a line to the roof, as if the paperweight were a compass for sunlight. She set it back precisely where it had been because human hands like to complete circles. She found the lobby again and locked the doors because the county liked their consultants to act like a final person on the scene. On the desk, her chalk-line coil had been laid out and rewound more tidily than she had left it. Beside it rested a folded index card. It was not old. It was the sort of supply you'd buy this year to label pie plates. On one side, someone had written, in a neat, almost architectural hand, "Clear night." On the other side, "Bring a blanket." The card's corners were crisp. The pen's line was sure. The advice belonged to 100 years of nights on that hill. She did not take the card. She left it, the way people leave a light on in a hallway for other people they will never meet. The drive down the mountain always took longer in the mind than on the clock. Pine brakes whispered their secrets. The valley exhaled its warm breath toward the cool slopes. She thought of the eras contained in those corridors, the shoes that had stopped halfway along a skybridge to look out and breathe, the patient conversations a building can have with wind and paint and chairs. She thought of the bell that had not rung when a hand did not pull and had nevertheless made a sound. Some places keep speaking whether a person asks questions or not. Weeks later, when her report found its way through committees, the conversion proposal took a different shape. The solarium would stay a solarium. The roof would remain a roof of loungers and flags. The schedule boards would keep their blank lines for arrows. A new stair would render the confusing landing into a faithful narrator. And the numbers would be corrected with care that honored the joke the building had told. The funicular bay would become a small theater for the story of how humans once thought sun and air were as curative as any medicine, which was not a wrong thought at all. At the first public tour, neighbors walked with the caution people use in rooms that deserve respect. They put their palms to glass and felt cold honesty. They read the volunteer's journal on its display and nodded at the small blessings. Someone rang the little brass bell without offense, and it answered neatly, like a good vowel. Near the lobby desk, a folded index card sat under a paperweight with a bubble inside, and the card's 2-line message made people smile in the soft way. People smile when an old building remembers manners. Orla went one last time when stars were out, not to measure, not to take. The roof accepted her boot soles with a quiet that had the dignity of a closed book opening a little. She unfolded a blanket and lay back and watched constellations draw their own point clouds. The wind wrote names of people she did not know, and hardly needed to. In the glass of the solarium behind her, faint reflections paced the corridor the way trained hands pace at night measured. Soft, ready. The mountain was in a good mood, and the building kept the quiet for it. In that balance, a person could hear their own breath behave the way a story behaves when it knows where it is going. Slow, steady, and full of room to keep going. Story number 4. Red Ridge General kept one eye open long after the rest had gone dark. From the valley at night, drivers could still see a slow blink from the hilltop. A patient pulse. like a lighthouse. The helipad beacon had never learned to sleep. The hospital closed years ago, the wards emptied, the doors chained, but that light kept to its pattern on, off, on no longer a guide for rotor blades, now just a rumor on the horizon. Neighbors called the city called the FAA. The FAA called a contractor with a practical temperament and a tidy toolbox. Evan arrived at dusk with a safety harness across his shoulder and a lockout kit hanging from his belt. He used to fix broadcast towers. Decommissioning a roof beacon felt like a simpler cousin to that work. The ambulance bay held his footsteps and gave them back cleanly. A bronze plaque by the door listed donors from a decade when naming rights were optimism. Above it, a faded mural of a helicopter hovered over a stylized H, the paint softened to a color like T. Inside, afternoon light lay across the lobby like a long blanket. The reception desk held a jar of pens that had survived all the departures. A wall of directional signs pointed to rooms that no longer invited anyone. Imaging, rehab, family quiet room. Evan carried his gear toward the stairs because the elevators didn't have power. Emergency exit signs glowed the kind of green reserved for night travel, the paint that remembers light and gives it back in small kindnesses. Air moved through the building's throat with the settled hush of a place that has kept secrets politely. He checked a laminated plan clipped to a clipboard on his belt. Roof access via stair C. Along the first landing, he passed a physical therapy corridor with a lane of taped footprints on the floor left, right, left printed in alternating darks, as if a path had been rehearsed 1,000 times. They were small, steady, and almost cheerful. A metronome once used for gait training sat on a shelf, its needle still and its tick asleep. As he climbed, the emergency lights along the stairwell paused and then brightened, nearly imperceptibly. A slow tide of brightness the color of dusk through glass. The door to the roof access hall had a push bar that gave with decorum. A maintenance office sat to the right. Its window faced the helipad's mast and the beacon lens that made the hill blink. He set his case on a counter and leafed through a binder labeled Air Operations. Most of it was routine battery checks, bulb changes, notes about a windsock that wanted replacement every spring. In a neat hand, someone had penciled in a margin. If the valley fog comes early, switch to low-intensity pattern at 2,100. Pilots appreciate a softer night. He pictured a tech with coffee at one hand and a multimeter at the other, doing small courtesies for strangers in the sky. He found the breaker panel in the corner, a gray door with badge labels in white tape. Beacon. Repeater. Pad lights. He flipped his tester across the bus. The building hummed faintly residual charge, not service power. He turned the beacon breaker to off and hung a red tag through the hole. Do not energize. Lockout. Tagout was ritual as much as safety. He worked cleanly, quickly. Through the window, the helipad still blinked. He watched, counted. 2 seconds on. 2 seconds off. The panel agreed that the light was dead. Something else had the circuit. He traced conduit along the ceiling and found a separate line bundled with a note written directly on the metal in marker. BAT. Bypass. In the corner, a steel locker bore a sticker with a helicopter silhouette. Inside sat neatly strapped battery bricks like carry-on luggage, wired into a small inverter with a green LED that pulsed breathing, alive. A piece of tape across the top read, "Keep on. Below clouds, they look for us." The tape's edges were worn, where a thumb had worried them, not rebellious, just attentive. He pulled the DC fuse, wrote a second tag, and watched the green LED slow and settle. He waited for the helipad's blink to cease. It didn't. The lens kept its rhythm. Not cocky, just steady. Evan compressed a breath and laughed softly. Somewhere in the head, there was one more layer. He took the stairs up the last flight to the roof. The air met him with clean honesty. The ridge collected wind from 3 counties and taught it to behave. The pad stretched ahead, the paint of the H ghosting under a film of dust. The beacon on its short mast wore a cylindrical lens banded in glass like a many-layered cake. A windsock hung at half attention, orange gone to apricot. Evan crouched by the base and measured voltage. A whisper there, yes, coming from a backup he hadn't yet found. He killed it at the masthead anyway. The lens went dark, and in its place the H itself pulsed a soft, milk-green glow that rose and fell as a cloud moved across the moon. Not electricity. Photoluminescent paint held onto the last of day and gave it back, from the valley, that would still read as a blink. Wind worked the guardrail into a long, low tone. He clipped his harness to the anchor point and loosened the lens collars. Underneath, 3 bulbs sat in a ring, their filaments intact, the metal cups clean. A moth husk rested in the bottom, weightless, not a body so much as the memory of a light-seeking idea. He brushed it free with a care that surprised him. The wind caught it and rode it into the night. On the radio clipped to his shoulder, a faint voice rose. He hadn't keyed it. The scanner simply found a frequency where words kept an appointment with air. Red Ridge Base, inbound from North Ridge, 5 miles, 2 souls, fuel 40 minutes. The call cadence was precise. The kind you learn by saying a sentence often enough that your mouth knows the steps. The channel marker read a frequency long retired for this hill. Evan listened without moving. He glanced across the valley. The sky was empty except for one late plane, a far, fast satellite of the city on the other side. The voice repeated, and then fell away on its own, like a training loop left in a machine. He finished his work at the mast. The lockout tags fluttered from his belt like tidy flags. Back at the battery locker, he removed the entire bypass unit and wrote on a fresh card, "Retired, lights to be preserved for museum exhibit, contact facilities." He taped it to the box and felt the odd sense that writing a label closed a small door in the world. He returned to the maintenance office and wrote his steps into the logbook in a hand tidy as the last text. Beacon de-energized, battery bypass removed, residual luminescence visible on pad markings. He put a dot beside the sentence because his own habits liked to punctuate lists with quiet certainty. As he left the office, the corridor lights by the roof access flickered one after another down the hall, a polite cascade like runway edge lamps. They stopped at a hatch he hadn't planned to open a door with a round window, the kind that keeps dust out of clean rooms. He understood the temptation to follow a light trail. He resisted it once, and then, in the way people do when a building seems to have an opinion, he went anyway. The hatch gave into the Life Flight Lounge. The room was intact in the way of a place left in a hurry but with care. 2 recliners, a table with a ring of moisture stained into its wood from cups not there, a whiteboard with weather written in blue marker ceilings, visibility, a simple VFR, where someone had left a question and then not answered it. A corkboard held a paper that read night check in large letters with a list beneath. Fuel? Oil? Stretcher straps? Beacon? The last item held a checkmark in pencil that looked new. He put his thumbnail to it, and it didn't smear. Behind the recliners, a window faced the valley. He turned the room light off, because its reflection bothered the view. The valley blinked, not from the mast but from the slow heartbeat of the city far away. He left the hatch open. On the way down one landing, he paused at the rehab corridor again. The taped footprints that marked a patient's return to walking looked slightly different. One pair shifted the smallest fraction toward the wall, as if a person had learned to hug the rail a little more. He knew the tape couldn't move. His brain had. Still, he stood for a minute and placed his boots thoughtfully. He took one step. Somewhere, a sensor found a memory of a program, and a faint beep sounded at the tempo of his stride once, twice, 3 times, and then it quit. Because circuits sleep when they are allowed. In the communications room near the lobby, an overhead paging console sat with a coiled microphone draped like a sleeping snake. The master volume knob had a dot of nail polish at the 7, a memorial to whoever preferred that setting. He touched the console lightly, and it clicked in the way old electronics do when their capacitors remember they once held charge. The building's chime tone, the bing-bong that had once asked everyone to listen, rose as a ghost in the metal, and then faded into practicality. He put his ear to the grill, heard only his own breath, and returned the microphone to its hook in a cleaner arc than it had hung in before. He stepped outside to the dock to see what the roof looked like now from the ground. The sky made a bowl. The pad above did not blink, but the hospital's glazed corner windows still caught the passing of cars on the valley road and threw back small shutters of light. To a driver, those might look like a regular pulse. He made a note to tell the city that reflections would do the work of rumor for a while yet. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A text from the FAA contact read simply, "If it's not unsafe, let it sleep with dignity." It made him smile. Not every instruction was written in a manual. He came back the next evening anyway, because a neighbor with a dog in a sweater had sworn the light returned. He parked on the shoulder and watched. The mast stayed obediently dark. A rhythm shone faint and warm streetlights down the hill on a timer, a far radio tower marking itself to pilots. The hospital contributed only what its paint could give, until the night took it back. Evan climbed to the roof once more, partly to confirm, partly because the air on that hill deserved attention. The windsock turned on its pole with a whisper. He tightened its ring bolts and freed a catch that had kept it stuck facing the wrong wind. Small kindnesses counted. The windsock perked like an animal understanding it would be allowed to be itself again. On his way down, he noticed a sign he'd walked past twice without seeing. Above the stairwell hung a framed card, hand-lettered in steady script. After night arrivals, leave the roof beacon one cycle longer than necessary. It makes families feel looked after. The ink had faded to the color of fog. The sentiment hadn't. He paused, not in sentimentality, only in accord. People had leaned on this light like a promise. Now the hill would keep promises a different way. He returned the keys and filed his neat report. In the line that asked for remarks, he wrote, "Beacon decommissioned. Residual glow remaining on pad markings after dark. Recommend interpretive signage for any future visitors, observing the site from the road to minimize reports." He almost added something about the wind, learning to sing through guardrails, about the way emergency lights in a corridor can behave like a path. He did not. Some experiences are better when they are allowed to belong to the place. Months later, the Historical Society took the beacon head into their care. They set it on a pedestal in a small room with a map of the valley and a few photographs of the hospital's last day. The lens stayed dark in its case, unless a child pressed a button, at which point a gentle bulb inside gave 3 slow blinks and slept. A sign beside it explained the pattern in plain words. People lingered longer than the blinks lasted, as if expecting a fourth, and smiled at themselves when it did not come. Across the room, a windsock hung from the ceiling and traced invisible drafts made by footsteps, pointing this way and that in agreeable surprise. As for the hill, it learned new habits. Bats stitched their cursive at dusk over the H that no longer hosted blades. Rain collected on the paint lines and ran in filaments toward the drain. In winter, snow found the pad early and left it late. The Life Flight Lounge remained tidy in its stillness. Sometimes a security camera aimed at sunrise caught a shadow crossing the room in a regular way, station to station, as if someone were still checking the list. Fuel, oil, straps, beacon. The film showed nothing definitive, just a slow change in light where air moved. The guard wrote draft in the log and drew a small square around the word, as if to give it a home. Drivers at night still saw a pulse sometimes, a flick of something that made them glance toward the hill. It was only their own headlights bouncing off a window, the residual glow of paint, the low cloud deciding to send a borrowed blink down for a visit. It didn't matter what made it. What mattered was the way the valley kept that rhythm in its periphery. A gentle reassurance misremembered as a warning. A former nurse passing one evening with grocery bags in the passenger seat slowed and looked up. She knew the beacon was down. She knew what reflections can do. But the timing of the faint blink was exactly how she remembered it. And it made her heart ease without any need to explain. She drove on, and the hill stayed properly dark, and the air turned itself over like a page. Evan kept the pencil he'd found in the air operations binder, a yellow stub with the hospital's name embossed almost invisible on its side. He used it to label small things in his shop. Sometimes, while writing, he'd catch the end of a slope in the letter of a word and remember the way the roof wind made a tone in the guardrail that was not quite a note, but felt like one. He'd remember how the exit signs had flickered in the hall, as if speaking runway language to a person who had once learned another dialect of light. When that memory arrived, it didn't ask to be believed. It asked to be noticed, and then allowed to rest. The last battery brick from the bypass found a second life balanced on a shelf by his workbench, tagged, "Discharged." The tag kept curling at the corners. He'd flatten it with his thumb when he passed. Somewhere on the hill, the tiny dot of luminous paint in the center of the H quietly gave back the last of a day's brightness, and then conceded to night. The building did not mind. Patterns change. Care takes new shapes. From the valley, the absence of a blink was its own kind of reassurance, like the moment a steady noise stops and a person realizes they were sleeping, not watching. The hill learned to hold that kind of quiet. The sky learned to miss nothing, and the rooms beneath, empty of machines, kept a softness that outlasted their power, asking nothing more demanding than this. Walk gently if you pass, and if you see a light that isn't there, let it be a memory doing its job. Story number 5. Riverbend Auxiliary sat where the water slowed. The hospital's main campus had been rebuilt across town, but the old sleep disorders wing remained by the river, a box of rooms painted in quiet colors. From the interstate, it looked like a set of eyelids at half-mast. A crooked sign still named it the Somnus Center in cursive that leaned as if tired. The windows wore nightshade film that kept sunset soft. The lawn had grown into velvet, deer cropping it in even passes. Inside, carpet muffled the past and held a faint, clean scent like blue laundry. Naya had worked here once, long ago, when the business of the night was to watch brains fall into rhythms. Now the university wanted a record of analog methods before the last of the chart recorders went to surplus. She arrived with a tidy Pelican case of converters, a coil of extension cord, a USB interface wrapped like a pastry, and a thermos that promised focus. She unlocked the control room with a key the facilities manager had found in a drawer marked ODDS. The key turned with the quiet relief of muscle memory. The control room was a glass box facing 6 bedrooms. In each, a narrow bed, a side chair, a lamp with a dimmer, and the little camera that once watched for sudden movements that meant wakefulness. At 2 desks beneath the glass, chart recorders waited like friendly typewriters that had traded their letters for lines. Each machine had a paper roll threaded in its mouth, its pens lifted on tiny metal arms, its channels labeled in block letters: EOG, EEG, EMG, airflow, chest, abd, oxy. Naya ran a hand over one recorder's lid as if it were a sleeping pet and felt the smoothness where hands had polished it over thousands of nights. She plugged the least temperamental of the recorders into the small inverter she'd brought in case the building power was fussy. The inverter hummed a steady G. The recorder's power light winked green. She pushed the paper advance. The roll crept forward, leaving a patient ladder of blue on the grid. It was like coaxing a fountain to start after winter. She adjusted the pen tension, satisfying as a zipper finding the right tooth. On the wall above the console, an analog clock still read a time before closing 9:7. The minute hand just past the marker. It was a clock with a personality. Someone had painted its frame the color of chamomile tea. Naya did not trust halted clocks. She checked her wristwatch and wrote the true time at the top of her field notebook. Outside, the river moved like a thought that has made up its mind. In the hallway, a motion sensor woke a line of nightlights in the baseboard, each a small, round, friendly moon at ankle level. She began with tapes. A steel cabinet held stacks of cassettes labeled in a careful hand. Night 1, Night 2, Maintenance QRS. The sounds weren't people's voices. They were calibration tones, timer clicks, the long hush of rooms breathing. She loaded one into her interface, watched the software find a carrier tone, and translate it into waveform. On her laptop, a long gray ribbon unfolded, marking empty time. At 2 minutes, the technician's checklist knocked gently. Tap. Tap at the headboard to verify sound channel. Naya smiled, without being sure why it felt like someone saying hello. On the other side of the glass, Room A held its quiet with dignity. A machine on the side table, a CPAP unit with soft straps, coiled like a small animal, sat unplugged. Its water tank had dried to a bloom of mineral that looked like frost. When she looked away and then back, the straps seemed arranged differently, not messy now but laid out with calm. In Room B, the chair had been pulled 2 inches closer to the bed, as if someone had thought better of the distance. These were the sorts of changes buildings sometimes make when people aren't looking. Small corrections the day would never notice. The intercom above the console wore a button labeled Lights Out Tone. She had been the one who pressed that button once for real, at 10 o'clock, when patients settled under blankets, papers signed, sensors placed, night chosen. She would press it tonight only to archive the sound. The building had no power. and yet the tiny LED beside the button held a faint ember. She pressed it with the soft pressure you use for a sleeping child's shoulder. Somewhere in the ceiling, a speaker cleared its throat. A synthesized chime, warm and low as a lullaby, hummed from the vents. It wasn't loud. The sound wandered gently down the hall like a kindly nurse walking without shoes. The baseboard lights answered by dimming half a step without darkening. She went into room D to test the rails because the paper labeled chest sometimes sang when it shouldn't. The air smelled like paper that remembers hands. A drawer held the little cups of conductive paste, their lids gone brittle with a chalky bloom that looked like frost on windows. A number card sat on the nightstand, the kind you clip outside a door for the technologist. D4. Room D's walls wore decals of clouds in slow motion, their edges softened by time. The bed was made in a style that names a person as welcome without fuss. On the pillow lay a sleep mask with a silly smile printed where a face would be. The elastic was still springy. She hung it on the headboard and went back to the console. The oldest recorder coughed a tiny hiccup and then steadied, pens lowering to paper with a modest click like a pen cap settling. Naya watched lines gather meaning. A slow wave, a scatter like feathers, a smooth plateau. It was nothing, only a signal from a test source. And yet the patterns tugged a part of her mind, trained to see stories in waves. On the taped calibration file, a faint voice had been captured by accident. "Lights out," it said, the words a breathy burr in the space between tones. It could have been her, or any of a dozen techs who had taken turns with the chime. A reply, almost a whisper. "Okay." That word had a smile in it. She documented the incidental capture for the archive and kept working. On her third pass to room A, she found the CPAP unit's display alive with a single segment curled into a C, then fading. There was no cord in the wall. She traced the power brick to the floor. It lay on its side like a turtle. The display winked once more, then went to a sober gray. Buildings hold eddies of charge like ponds, hold cold in shadow. She knew this, and still she stood for a moment and watched her breath cloud in the window's reflection and then thin. 2 hours in, the clock in the control room had crept. She didn't see it move. It simply told a different truth when she remembered to look. 11:52. The second hand ticked without noise. On the console, a line of LEDs lit and then died, traveling from left to right the way words do in languages where sentences move that way. The feeling pressed on her like a heavy quilt and then lifted. She ate a cracker from her bag and kept her eyes on the paper. The baseboard moons along the hall glowed a little brighter and then a little dimmer in a cycle she could have plotted. 90 minutes. That was the duration she used to watch for time enough for a full loop of stages. She jotted the times when the floor seemed to breathe. At exactly 1:38, the intercom became a throat again. "Stage 2, murmured a voice with the creaminess of an old recording. It might have been an echo she had triggered by accident. It might have been the room's old logic remembering its job. She stood and stretched, and let the window reflect her as a silhouette among machines. The reflection changed when she moved, not in the way reflections do because of geometry, but in a manner that suggested her shadow had adjusted its shoulders independent of her. It seemed to look toward room C. That was silly. She breathed once, twice, like the chart showed. A pale thread of steam from a pipe somewhere high in the wall whispered something like a hush disguised as a vowel. Room F had filmed glass over its window, a habit for privacy when wires visit faces. She could see the suggestion of a bed and a chair and a wall clock beyond it. The clock's red hand winked like a sleeping heartbeat. She liked that it felt like a humanizing of measurement. When she lifted the receiver to the room phones to test a tone, the headset delivered a quiet rush of air like a tide beneath a wharf. She imagined the long conversations those lines had carried. "I'm okay. I'm going to try to sleep now. Tell me something ordinary. Tomorrow I'll make pancakes." The headset offered no words, only the hush of circuits deciding not to wake. Her equipment behaved better the longer she stayed. The inverter's hum took on a warmer quality. The recorder's pens stopped their tentative scratches and planted themselves like trees. Naya threaded a fresh roll of paper into channel 2. The paper smelled faintly of ink and winter closets. She put a date on the leader in pencil for the archive and wrote the building's name in careful block letters. The graphite looked friendlier when it entered the dot matrix of the grid. At 2:30, A light someone had labeled in tape as arousals flickered once on the console. It had no power. She had not wired that channel. And yet the little red eye opened politely and shut, a wink like a person seeing someone they know from a distance. In room B, the sleep mask she had hung on the headboard now hugged the pillow unarguably, as if someone had chosen it and then remembered they did not need it. In room C, the chair had turned toward the bed with gentle conviction. The cameras did not record. Even if they had been live, what was happening was not for tapes. It was for the room. She set her thermos down and touched the intercom button as a test. "Control to D," she said. Static answered with a kindness that told her. It was listening. A low, round tone like the sound inside a seashell came back, then faded. She imagined the alphabet of those tones that once told whole stories to the techs in the glass box. Chimes that meant up, buzzes that meant awake, soft ticks that meant only turn a pillow. It would have been easy to consider how much happened in these rooms that never made a single photograph. Instead, she considered the river working at the window and how water understands repetition without boredom. Sometime after 3, she drifted at the console without sleeping. That light fall into a layer where time unravels itself and lets its threads lie parallel. It was not a dream, not a vision. It was the specific trance of having spent 1,000 nights listening for something and hearing only breath. When she blinked, the old chart recorder had drawn a shape that looked like a little staircase down into a smooth lake. It was textbook stage 3. Below that, a wilder scribble in the EOG channels told of quick eyes. Her logbook remained where she'd left it, her pen uncapped. The paper roll's printed margin ticked its marks at regular inches, small black flags indicating distance traveled. There was an observation mirror on the hall near the washroom, convex, the kind that lets you see around corners. In it, the baseboard moons doubled and doubled until they became a string of pearls. A small shape moved along the far end of the hall, not taller than the bed rails, traveling at a steady pace like someone counting steps toward sleep. When she went to meet it, the hall held nothing but its carpet and air, and a faint perfume of herbal shampoo from a plastic dispenser that had been empty for years. The night did not give up its economy. On the corkboard at the back of the control room, a laminated card had been pinned for years. Night checklist. Below it, the steps. Introduce. Explain. Comfort. Observe. Intervene gently. Mark events. Lights on at 5:45. She had once clipped that to a clipboard. The corners of the card curled upward now. A little boat on a still river. Someone had stuck a gold star beside the last line, Quiet Pride. She touched the star, and it still had a little adhesive in its skin. At 4:30, the hallway's low lights brightened exactly enough to read a newspaper. That had been a protocol, a trick to coax bodies toward morning. The intercom breathed once and spoke no words, only a tone that made her arms feel lighter. She walked the rooms one more time, checking no patients, and yet feeling accountable to the night. In room A, the CPAP water tank held the smallest haze of condensation, as if a fog had visited and left without making a case for itself. In room E, the closet door that had stuck for a decade opened, and then settled closed without complaint. In room F, the clock's red hand stopped winking and went steady. Morning had chosen to begin. By the time the sky decided to gray, she had packed the converters and labeled the digital files. The last chart roll in the recorder held a bedtime story told in voltage and ink, with all the old ink marks. K, complex like a folded wing, spindle like braided hair, rem like a quick fish in dark water. She tore the sheet in a clean line and placed it with the logbook and cassette in a flat archival envelope. She kept nothing for herself except a feeling of having sat with someone while they rested, even though that someone was a building. Outside, the river gave back the first blue of the day. Geese lifted their orderly vowels upstream. The Somnus Center's mirrored windows showed the world as if taken on a quiet film. She locked the control room and set the key on the front desk for facilities in an envelope she addressed in her neatest printing. On impulse, she turned back and pressed the lights out tone button once, not to make a point, just to say goodnight with the sound that place knew best. The chime traveled the hall with a softer foot than at 10 p.m., like a bedtime story read for the last time and then shelved. Weeks later, the museum mounted a small case with the recorder, a looped video of paper rolling past pens, and a heaped scarf of wires threaded to a foam head wearing a cluster of electrodes. Visitors tilted their heads as the sample charts called out their shapes. Spindles, waves, little storms. One line on the long printout had a faint wrinkle where Naya's thumb, tired but careful, had steadied the edge. In a side room, a speaker played a hush so convincing that parents who wandered in ended up whispering without telling themselves to. On the label, someone had quoted the checklist. Introduce. Explain. Comfort. Observe. It read like instructions for any kind of care. The Somnus Center remained by the river, weather sound and window quiet. At night, a single security bulb above the door held a patient halo. People on the walking trail sometimes paused and looked up, not afraid, just curious why the building seemed to watch the water so kindly. A night heron took to perching on the rail. Occasionally, at 10 p.m., a tone that could have been only wind in the ductwork slid down the hall and away. The baseboard moons eased brighter for a heartbeat and settled. No one in the dark rooms stirred. The beds breathed in their way. The building, empty of watchers, remembered how to keep the quiet. It kept it in good faith, like a promise written on a clipboard that survives every cabinet clean-out because no one can bring themselves to throw the simple ones away. Story number 6. Rook Memorial had been built to keep perfect time. Long before digital clocks glowed from every pocket, a single master clock in its basement sent a pulse through copper arteries, stepping every dial on every ward in unison. The hospital closed when a new complex rose by the freeway, but the old building had a habit. From the parking lot you could see it. Not light, not movement, just the suggestion that the place still measured minutes. Theo was a horologist by trade, called in by the Historical Society to remove the master clock for display. He loved mechanisms that made promises and kept them. He parked beside the loading bay, where painted lines had faded to the color of steep tea. A wind lifted leaves into slow spirals. The front doors were chained. Facilities had left a side gate open. Inside, the lobby smelled like paper and clean wool. The directional arrows on the linoleum were color-coded blue to surgery, yellow to pediatrics, green to administration. They met in a braided knot at a scuffed intersection, then went their separate ways like sentences choosing their verbs. Down a level, a sign read timekeeping with a little lightning bolt stenciled beside it in red, as if speed and clocks had been cousins. The door to the clock room opened into cool air and metal. On one wall, relay cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling, each marked with neat engraved plates: Wing A, Wing B, Cafeteria, Chapel, Loading. In the center stood a tall wooden case with a glass front, the master itself, stately as a grandfather who remembered when trains ran on promises. Behind the glass, the pendulum bob rested motionless, heavy and round, a dull brass moon. A narrow paper tape ran across a drum in the lower left, the kind that marks impulses with tiny teeth. It was empty, but the guides shone as if they expected work. Theo set his case on a table and checked the distribution board. The building's service mains were offline. The little indicator lamps born in another decade kept their secrets. He thumbed the latch on the master's case and opened it. Oil smell rose like a story. He ran his fingers over the escapement with reverence. This model did not rely on gravity alone. A small solenoid waited to kick the pendulum every minute, sending a clean, short shock to every daughter clock in the building. He touched the contacts. They were smooth, barely tarnished. He clicked his test source on. A tidy little box that sent the same square pulse the old clock would have. The relay board to his right answered with a single metallic snap. Far away, something small echoed it, a shunted sound that would have been just another step in a living hospital. He climbed the stair behind the boiler room to check a corridor dial. On the wall near a directory, a round clock watched the hall. Its hands pointed to 11:03. The second hand was absent. In this system, the minute hand jumped in neat little arcs. He waited. In the quiet, he heard a rhythm unlike the building's breath. Faint, steady, counting without insistence. Then the minute hand moved one precise tick to 11:04. He frowned at his test box in his pocket. He hadn't sent a pulse. He listened harder. A distant relay snapped. Another hand in another hall surely obeyed, stepping forward like a foot following chalk marks on the floor. The old-time system had redundancies. Often a small battery bank sat somewhere to keep the master alive through outages, a courtesy for operating rooms and schedules. Theo tried the clock room again and found, tucked behind the relay board, a metal drawer with 6 long cells sleeping in clips. Dust lay over it like a light snowfall. The meter he brought kissed the terminals and read nothing. The batteries were as dead as quarried stone. He taped them off anyway, a habit as much as a rule. Back in the hall, a wall clock at the nurse's station clicked. The minute hand thought about moving and then held still, like a child prepared to jump but waiting for the count to finish. The switchboard lived on the main floor near the gift shop, a room with many small lamps and a desk where cords once danced at the operator's touch. Theo couldn't help stepping inside. A row of staff photos on the wall smiled in black and white, name tags pinned to uniforms crisp as folded napkins. The board itself had been retired, but a tutoring sheet remained pinned above it with red string. Evening page. Chime twice. Speak clearly. Repeat. Beside it, an index card had been neatly lettered in pencil. Visiting hours. Conclude 8:0 p.m. Be kind at 5:02. It felt like a note to a future shift and to a building. He followed the green line toward administration. As he passed a family room with round-backed chairs, the overhead paging speakers hummed a breath. Nothing more then went quiet. On the ceiling above the crossroads, circular clocks looked down with similar faces, each with its minute hand, just a different degree off the hour, as if they'd taken turns leading. He chose a corridor at random and found the Surg ward. A nurse's desk sat in the center, its countertop worn smooth under long days of elbows. On the wall behind hung the annunciator panel, a grid of labeled windows for rooms. Each had a small flag that once popped to show a call. They were all quiet, all blank. One flag stood slightly proud of its slot, not out, not engaged, just attentive. The label beneath it read 217. He looked away, then back. The flag was flush. He wasn't sure whether his memory had been precise or kind. His test pulse tool wasn't connected to the master. The building had its own plans. Theo returned to timekeeping and watched the master's contacts. They were open. He waited a minute. They closed on their own, a soft kiss of silvered points. The solenoid napped. The relay bank to his right remained still. The building had stepped time without the master. Somewhere else a minute had been asked to happen, and the clocks had obeyed. He traced conduit with his eyes. A second, smaller cabinet sat in the corner, shorter, less impressive, with the practical label, secondary timer pasted across its door. Inside, a simple motorized cam rotated, so slowly he could barely see the motion, a wheel with notches and copper fingers sliding over them. The weekly program clock that once controlled bells in schools and shift whistles in factories, set here to ring the hospital chime for things like visiting hours and lights dim. The power lead to this cabinet had been cut clean. A tag with a date from 4 years ago hung from it. Yet the cam moved, soft as a moth investigating a lamp. He took out his pocket light and shone it across the edges. Sometimes you can see motion by seeing shadows. The cam did rotate, but not by electricity. Air was moving in the room, a slow, regular pluck from a vent that shouldn't be drawing. The air tugged a loose insulation flap, which ticked the cam once per minute like a fingernail flicking a toy. It wasn't enough to close contacts, but it had the music of cycle in it, and the building, used to obeying tiny, regular invitations to act, seemed to have decided to humor the ghost of a schedule. In the cafeteria, trays still lined shelves in an obedient army. A wall clock over the pass-through read 11. 11. No other clock did. He leaned on the counter and watched its hand. It stayed. The kitchen itself offered steel tables that remembered being wiped clean. A paper posted near the dishwash line read, 11. 15 quiet hour turn-down radio. He listened for a radio he knew he wouldn't hear, and heard instead the far beep of something that used to announce readiness, and now delivered only a memory of it. Theo took a slow route to the pediatric corridor. He didn't expect to find children's colors here. The ward had been repainted before closing. But the time system's sense of order didn't care about decor. 3 clocks hung in a row, one above a doorway, one over a fish tank. Blank wall, one close to the playroom window. They stepped together. He waited, and when they ticked, all 3 moved at once, in a solidarity he hadn't seen yet that day. He glanced down, and the painted floor line changed color beneath his shoes from pale blue to green. Not in fact, but in the way light told him it had. On the playroom wall, a paper kite left for years trembled once and settled. He could have blamed air. He often did. It's what air is for in stories like this. A generous culprit. On the third floor, the OR suites fell asleep in a deeper way. The hallway held its own cold. Double doors breathed out careful drafts. Upstairs, a balcony overlooked the city-old buildings with brick eyebrows, new cranes. The river bent like a lazy elbow. A wall clock above the scrub alcove reflected light in a ring. Theo stood in the doorway and watched the minute hesitate. Seconds don't exist on these clocks. Only choices between 1 minute and the next. The hand rose a hair, then settled again, as if in deference to something else that wanted to finish first. He returned to the clock room with a plan to make the master sing once for the archive, one clean minute impulse that would step every dial, a goodbye given in the building's first language. He set his test source to the right voltage, clipped it into the bus, and sent one tidy pulse. The relay bank answered in a chorus of snaps. Far off, the corridor clock that had rested jumped. The cafeteria's 11. 11 corrected to 11. 12. The nurse's station panel listened hard enough to be silent. He sent another pulse. The worn penny of light inside him felt a little warmer. He wrote on his pad, in a list he was making for the museum, include demonstration of minute impulse. After the second pulse, the overhead paging speaker above his head cleared its throat again and delivered 2 soft chimes, a simple interval like someone humming. The sound traveled through the ductwork and made little circles in air. The chime meant nothing now, or perhaps it meant exactly what it always had. Attention. Please. On his way toward the stairs, he passed an alcove with a long rack of time cards, each a narrow rectangle with a name in the top margin. Most slots were empty. 5 cards still hung. The ink had faded, but names remained. L. Vargas, S. Patel, J. Doyle, N. Green, and one at the bottom that had no stamp marks at all, only a printed line that read Visitor. The cardstock was crisp, as if it had been cut yesterday. There was a small pencil, in a chain cup beside the rack. He pinched the pencil between 2 fingers and lightly wrote the date in the corner of the visitor card out of habit. He did not mean anything by it. He hung it back, and as he turned, a small clock above the alcove moved itself 1 minute forward, as if approving an administrative detail finally completed. Rook Memorial had a courtyard at its heart, a square of sky caught by corridors. Theo crossed it on a second-floor bridge. Below, leaves gathered in a seam of wind, scuffed apart, and gathered again. The courtyard's own clock, mounted above a door with cheerful tile, was missing its glass. The hands had settled at a time that might have been meaningful if he were the sort who sought meaning in coincidences. He was not, and yet he looked at it too long and let the building suggest something to him without forming it into speech. In administration, a conference room held a long table and a screen where schedules had been projected for years. On the whiteboard, a grid still claimed days and times. A small magnet shaped like a red dot marked a square on Tuesday at 2:00. The label beside it read, Shift, Change. The magnet had faded on one side where the sun hit it, a pale crescent like a moon learning to be new again. He walked past it and wrote Shift Schedules into his list for the museum, then drew a small square beside it because his hand liked the comfort of boxes. He boxed the master clock with the care of a person packing away a voice. Padding cut to shape, straps drawn snug without strain. He labeled the crate in neat letters with its destination. He left the relay bank in place at the Society's request. The cabinets would be catalogued later. Before closing the wooden lid, he set the pendulum bob in a cradle made for it, a cup that held weight without argument. He touched the brass gently and thought of trains again, and of bells that ring on the hour where no one requires them to, but everyone is comforted when they do. On his way out, he took the long hall beside lab services, where the floor was marked with a thin line of red paint. He hadn't noticed it before. The line curved, doubled back, then resolved at a heavy door with a window like a submarine's porthole. A sign above read Master Clock Sync, authorized personnel only. Inside, a smaller panel sat above a desk, with a slot where a card used to be inserted nightly to correct drift. The slot held a piece of stiff paper. He slid it out. It wasn't a card. It was a page from a desk calendar, years ago, Tuesday, in an autumn, with the kind of date you remember only because it showed up on your lunch receipt. Someone had written, in a hand that did not rush, the words, "Keep it together, little one." There is no way to explain how a building as large as Rook could feel attentive. It had nothing to gain from moods. But as Theo walked the final corridor to the exit, the clocks along that path behaved like a row of heads nodding in a line. Each minute, for 3 minutes, they stepped in crisp sequence. Not together, but not entirely in their own worlds either. The effect was of a wave traveling along the hall at the speed of patience. He stood in a patch of sunlight and let it pass him, grateful the way a person is grateful when a bus arrives on time, even if it is empty. Outside, the wind made the maples flicker like fish. Theo loaded the crate. He glanced back once at the second-floor windows where, behind cheap blinds, the time system had kept the building honest long after honesty was required. One window reflected his van. Another reflected only sky. In one, he saw a circle of light that must have been a lens catching Sunday. It looked for a moment like a clock face from which hands had been removed deliberately so that no one would feel walked on. He drove to the museum with the radio off because silence has its own measures. In the new display room weeks later, the master clock stood between glass panels under warm light. The plaque explained how a single pulse had disciplined dozens of dials and why that mattered in a place where timing looks like kindness. Meals served when promised, shifts relieved when agreed, medicine not late. A small button on the pedestal allowed visitors to send 1-minute impulse. Children pressed it with ceremony. The clocks mounted around the room rescued dials from Rook's halls, stepped together with a polite click and held. A person standing among them could feel it in their chest, the brief lift, the neat arrival. Back at the old building, the Annunciator's flag for 217 stayed flush in its slot. The time card rack gathered an extra coat of dust, then another. The cafeteria clock relinquished its stubborn 11. 11. At sunset, shadows crossed the courtyard in long, slow clocks of their own. At odd moments, the paging speakers gave the lightest of breaths, the kind you hear when someone leans forward to speak and then decides not to. A guard changing rounds late read the word shift on the whiteboard and felt his shoulders unknot, though he could not say why. Theo kept the small pencil from the time card rack because the museum had left it to him when they found a box of spares. He wrote with it in his field book when he needed to name the present: time, date, building, weather. Once, when he looked at his notes later, a minute had been sketched in the margin, a crisp little tick mark drawn by a hand that used neatness to reassure itself. He didn't remember making it. He did not mind. Not everything recorded in the language of minutes has to be pinned down to the second. Sometimes it is enough to say, "It happened. It kept happening. And it was gentle." The last time he passed Rook Memorial on a job across town, he pulled into the old lot and listened. Uneven windows reflected weather. The blue, yellow, and green lines on the floor inside had forgotten their bright arguments and became just color. He stood by the door long enough to hear one relay snap somewhere in the heart of the building at the top of a minute. That could have been any number of things settling. It could have been a bird practicing what to call a rooftop, or it could have been a spin of metal acknowledging the hour out of habit. He felt for a moment exactly on time. Then the feeling went the way minutes go when they have moved into the next. Story number 7. Blue Turn Medical's hyperbaric unit sat in a low annex with no windows on the seaward side, as if the building preferred to listen to the coast rather than look at it. A concrete ramp led to double steel doors with weathered handles, shaped like the dogs on a ship's hatch. A faded decal on the glass read, "Diving Medicine," in block letters that still felt reassuring. The rest of the hospital had long ago moved uphill, but the chamber stayed put. Moving steel like that is not a small decision. Salt mist kept the paint honest. The annex smelled like clean rubber, coil springs, and old air that had learned patience. Wren arrived late in the day with a rolling case and a clipboard that didn't rattle. The Medical History Museum wanted the unit's manuals, the treatment boards with their chalk ghosts, a box of headset handsets, and if facilities allowed a small panel from the gauge board. Wren had read the old maintenance notes in a library basement. Oil the dog pins, cycle the communication selector, check the bibs mask valves. Those lines read like tiny prayers, written in the margin of a manual. Inside, the light was soft and steady, a kind of afternoon that never ends. The chamber filled the room, A double-lock steel cylinder with portholes like patient eyes, paint the color of storm milk. An outer hatch stood ajar. The dogs fanned out like a dozen metal elbows. A chalkboard on a sliding rail ran along the wall, neatly sectioned. Depth, time, oxygen, air, hold. A faint white schedule still clung to it, written in a neat hand with a little flourish on the zeros. TT6, 285 min. Someone had drawn a tiny fish in the main corner and given it a grin as if to say, "See you on the surface." Ren set the case on the bench and walked the room like a person greeting a familiar machine. The gauge board faced the chamber, big round dials labeled depth, chamber pressure, oxygen percent, with needles that had settled shyly against their stops. Under the dials, a row of brass valves waited in a line. Supply, vent, blowdown. Above them, an intercom headset hung from a hook, its coiled cord looped tidily. Ren lifted the headset with two hands the way people lift something that has carried a lot of voices, then set it back with care. A sidelight above the hatch flickered and found its steadiness. The building had no active service power, but a small emergency inverter in the corner still kept the room from forgetting its job. Its LED pulsed, not fast, not weak, just breathing. Ren plugged in the humidity logger to check the chamber's air. The port in the hatch accepted the probe with a satisfying snug click. The rubber grommet had remained pliant. Inside, the chamber returned a reading that pleased the part of Ren that hates rust, dry as an archives joke. It was quiet in the way of places that have hosted concentration. The floor was painted steel with a grit texture. The benches inside bolted to the deck in gentle arcs. Bibbs manifolds, the breathing system that once delivered oxygen through soft hoses, ran the length of the inner wall, each port labeled with a number in tidy vinyl. A canvas bag marked emergencies only hung from a hook beside a small window like an old habit waiting to be invited. Ren got to work. Manuals first. A steel cabinet with a combination lock obediently opened to a set of binders, their tabs crisp with dates. The covers read with plain certainty: U.S. Navy Diving Manual, Therapeutic, Revision. There were hand-typed supplements with warnings in red ink about oil-free air, about no spark sources, about patience. Ren boxed them between two sheets of foam, labeled the carton, and moved to the chalkboard. It slid on its rail with a gentle exhale of chalk dust. The little fish grinned as it passed. Ren photographed the last schedule, TT6, which meant a slow, thorough ride up the ladder of pressure, a town's kindness expressed as numbers. The eraser on the tray had worn to a soft shape that would fit a hand like a bird. Ren picked it up and hesitated. It felt wrong to wipe away something that had held the shape of time for people. The eraser went back to its place. A switch near the board read "Call." It was a simple bell, a coil, and a striker, and would have clanged inside the chamber to say, "Ready, give us a sign." Ren pressed it without thinking. The button had the allure of any neat mechanism. The striker tapped once against metal, and then calmed. A second, fainter ring answered, slow and visiting, from within the inner lock, as if sound had taken its ease on the way. Ren leaned toward the hatch and listened. The silence felt capable. The chamber had two doors, the outer hatch for the room and the inner for the lock within. On impulse that felt like respect more than curiosity, Ren stepped into the outer lock. It was bright without being harsh. The deck remembered footsteps, a faint map of rubber soles pooled in the paint where people once braced themselves for pressure. Ren did not dog the hatch. The dogs remained splayed, their authority obvious, even while at rest. Inside, the benches curved away, portholes admitting light in round, clear gifts. The headset inside hung from its own hook. Ren touched the headband, not to wear it, only to feel the leather that had survived 100-hour weeks. The intercom crackled with the lightest suggestion of a voice, sibilance without letters, then a hush that could have been the room passing a note to itself. Ren let the headset settle. The gauge marked depth with a tolerant wink. The needle trembled half a hair width away from zero, and then returned. Air warms, air cools. Needles learn to sigh. On the chamber's far side, a small whiteboard showed a list of names, first initials, last names written in blue. Next to each, a checkmark in green. The last line had a date from years ago and an empty box. No one had forgotten. They had left the box open because that's what you do when you plan to return. Ren's pen hovered, and then obeyed its proper gravity and went back into a pocket. Not this. Not here. The museum wanted the comm selector too. Ren unscrewed it with a care that bordered on affection. Behind it, a neat tangle of wires showed patience. Color, coded, labeled, looped with grace. A little tag tied with twine read, in tidy block letters, "Don't yank." That would have made anyone smile. Ren slipped the selector into a padded sleeve and placed it in the box with the manuals. Just then, the chamber made a sound that was not wind. A soft exhale, then a long, gently rising tone. The gauge needles moved half a degree, and then half again, as if woken by a story they loved. The intercom clicked. A voice, not words, but the weight and courtesy of speech came in on a carrier of static. It had the cadence of training phrases and comfort. Ren heard something like, "Hold at 60, and a ghost of a timer's neat beep counting intervals. The annex had no compressor running. No valves had been touched. The room had remembered the shape of a treatment, and was doing it quietly, with nothing but its wires. Ren stood with a hand on the hatch frame and watched the chalkboard. The fish still grinned. The eraser breathed a little chalk. A draft moved through the doorway from the corridor. It smelled like salt and machine oil, the scent of clean function. The emergency inverter's LED glowed steady. The tiny relief valve at the top of the lock gave a single respectful chirp. A person could make a lot of the soundscape of a building if they wanted to. Ren didn't need to. It was enough that the room was telling a story of care. A map tacked beside the gauge panel showed a schematic of the chamber. Outer lock, inner lock, main. Little arrows indicated airflow. At the bottom, in small print, a sentence: "If nervous, narrate. People tolerate pressure better when someone counts kindly." It was a note to staff and, in its way, to the steel itself. This place had been built to share a single breath among strangers until everyone could breathe their own again. That logic doesn't turn off neatly. Ren took the long way around the outer hull, hand on the curve like a person walking a friend's perimeter. A bolt head had been polished by too many shoulders squeezing past in heavy suits. A grease pencil line beside a peep port read, 30 feet. A memory of a harmless game to guess depth before checking gauges. Through another port, the bench loomed like a shore. Ren's reflection in the glass looked like a figure in an old photograph, slightly washed by the curve, recognizable to anyone who had ever seen a person do a job carefully. The far wall held a framed certificate about safety in clean rooms and oxygen occupancies. The printed signatures at the bottom had the confident loops of people who understood that caution can be a kind of affection. Beneath it sat a small refrigerator once used to keep water cold for long sittings. It still hummed faintly. Ren opened the door. The light inside worked. 2 paper cups nestle-stacked like shells gazed from the shelf. The cold air smelled like nothing, which is a luxury. A small brass bell hung by the door. Its placard read, "Only for arrival." Someone had tied a length of white cord to its pull, knotted in a way that suggested a sailor's touch. Ren did not ring it. The memory of its tone seemed to hover in the room anyway, the round, carrier wave note a bell makes when everyone lets their shoulders go down. The museum's list included 1 oxygen bib, which was the soft mask assembly. Ren opened a bin and found a row of them coiled like gray sea creatures. Straps clean, lenses unclouded. One mask had a name written in marker. Along its band, T. Leong. The ink had blurred, letters becoming islands. Ren chose a mask without a name and placed it gently in a bag, not wanting to disturb a story that belonged to hands. Out the annex door, the shore machinery sang its usual dusk chorus rigging, knocking at masts a few blocks away, a horn testing itself, the gull-absent hush of an evening that had not asked for wind. The hospital's old parking lot held the echo of this, a tide of cars long gone. A plaque near the stairs told the brief history of the unit. Installed to serve divers, then used for carbon monoxide exposures and stubborn ear troubles, then retired with grace. A line at the end said, "This room kept pressure on behalf of the weary." It was not poetry in its intent. It sounded like it by accident. Ren returned to the chamber to pack the last requested piece. The little egg, timer used as redundancy, a charming old kitchen tool with a smooth click and a bell that would never startle someone wearing headphones. It sat on a shelf beside a stack of folded towels, striped in pale blue. Ren twisted the timer to 3 minutes and let it run while coiling a cable. The clicks wove themselves into the room's rhythm. When the bell rang, it sounded like a thumb flicking a glass, simple, perfect. On the chalk rail lay a stub of white chalk. Ren wrote, on the far edge of the board where the rail met the wall and where no eyes would bother to read, "Thank you." The chalk caught, squeaked, left a shy mark. Ren blew gently and watched the dust fall. The annex seemed to approve, the way a machine approves by not objecting. A carpet runner in the hall led toward a door marked air plant. Beyond it, 2 old compressors sat like retired beasts, hoses wound, fittings capped. A small note taped to one read, "If you must start me, tell me why first." The tone of it made Ren laugh under breath. People leave sentences behind them in certain jobs. They season the place. It is a kindness to read them in the right voice. One last sweep around the room. Check the latch tags, close the manuals cabinet, lift the box onto the dolly. Secure it with a strap that had the pleasant sound of webbing pulled through a buckle. The chamber sat with its own posture ready without being needy. Ren turned to go and saw the gauge for oxygen percent rise a hair and settle, a cat's ear acknowledging a bird through glass. The intercom breathed. A click, a hiss, a single syllable's idea. It would be easy to claim a message weighted in it. Better to claim this. The room had practiced sentences in support of calm for long enough that the air itself had shape. Ren left the annex light on to make facilities check easier. The key turned smoothly. Outside, the sky had become all gradient, mauve to blue to a line of gold right at the water. The annex sat in that color like a ship at standstill, anchors set on land. The museum would send a crew next week to remove the pieces with proper lifting gear and long dollies to finesse corners. A note on Ren's clipboard, in neat caps, read simply, "Bring a blanket." The chalkboard would ride better with something soft between it and the world. Later, in the museum, the chamber's gauge panel would hang on a wall with a button that let visitors watch the needles lift a little and return a motor beneath. Subtle, respectful. A recording of the intercom would play 2 faint tones that academia would label neutral, and anyone's shoulders would call gentle. The chalkboard would be installed on its rails, TT6 still written in a hand no one had the heart to erase. Children would press their noses to the glass and make circles with their fingers like portholes, and parents would read the plaque that said, "Pressure can help. It's just air used with patience." One small thing would sit on a pedestal with a card that read, simply, "Bibs mask. Unknown user." People would take pictures of their kids pretending to wear it and then behave, without direction, in a softer way in that room than in others. The bell by the door would have a sign that asked that it not be rung, and most would honor the sign. Those who didn't would ring it once, hear the shy round note, and blush, not because they'd been wrong, but because the sound taught them how to listen. Blue Turn's annex stayed in place until the developers found another life for steel. Nights. The emergency inverter's LED sometimes kept its slow breath on behalf of nothing but habit. The wind from the sea remembered how to move around round things. Occasionally, at the wind's change, the relief valve atop the lock made its bright, polite chirp. Walkers on the sidewalk turned their heads. They didn't call anyone. The building didn't ask for help. It rehearsed comfort. Ren drove by once and saw the side light glowing and laughed, not because anything was silly, but because it was good to know a room could be itself after the story had been told. Story number 8. The hospital's laundry sat down by the river, behind the main pavilions where deliveries used to come in and steam went out. A brick rectangle with high windows and a sawtooth roof, it had a tall vent stack that still remembered how to exhale. On cold mornings, you could see a thread of white drift from that pipe even years after closure, a habit of old metal releasing the last of the day. People forgot it was there until they rounded the bend and smelled that faint, clean starch that belongs to sheets. Mara had been asked to make an inventory for the museum machines, signage, a press if it could be dismounted. She knew textiles. She trusted the way fabric tells the truth. Late afternoon tugged long light through the high panes as she opened the service door and stepped into the sorting room. Red letters above two big doorways read, "Soiled on one side and clean on the other." Between them, a waist-high counter waited like a customs desk between two countries. The place didn't feel sad, exactly. It felt expectant, as if the tempo could be found again with a careful tap. Carts with tan canvas sides stood in a neat line, each with a stenciled number and two shallow dents in the rail, where hands pushed for years. Overhead ran monorails with little steel trolleys from which bags once hung like soft bells, the tracks peeling off toward chutes labeled by floor. A chalkboard listed assignments in a neat, no-nonsense hand. Wash 1 flatwork. Wash 2 towels. Ironer sheets. Fold corners. Deliveries A, C. East, tunnel. A second board held a note in pencil, the kind that expects to be erased and written again. Remember lint trap. 3 p.m. The graphite line had the courtesy of a person who knew not to shout. She crossed into clean and felt the floor change. There's a different polish to rooms where things are finished. The big washers sat like submarines along one wall. Doors open, drums stilled with their punched holes catching light. The press mangle faced the center of the room, its feedboard long as a boat's deck, wool blankets wrapped on its drum like a sleeping roll. A rack of folding tables lined the far side, each with a plastic template pinned to it showing the sequence for a hospital corner, arrows and numbers in pale blue. A card tacked nearby read quietly, "Uniform folds move easier in carts." Mara set her case on a table and worked with method. Photos, measurements, notes. A pencil underlining what would lift and what would stay. The Mangle's control panel wore enamel labels like jewelry. Feed, steam, brake, cool down. The needle on a pressure gauge slept at 0. She put her palm on the feedboard. Wood holds temperature long after the air makes up its mind. It was warm, not hot, just the small kindness of a surface that remembered sunlight. Somewhere above, something small bumped. It sounded like a bag on a monorail, except no bags hung there now. She watched the nearest trolley. It trembled and settled. A cat's ear, noticing a bird. She looked up at the sawtooth roof. The high glass was steady, the light laid in, clean trapezoids. Dust swarmed and calmed. When she looked back down, a bit of chalk had appeared on the ironer's rail, a short line, like someone marked where to start feeding. It could have been scuff. It could have been memory. She took a photo and let the chalk be. The steam tunnel door was propped with a wedge of wood cut from a pallet. Inside, a low corridor ran under the hospital. Pipes color-banded with colors whose meaning you know even if you don't know you know them. Blue for cold, red for hot, yellow for gas, green for air. The tunnel didn't make spooky noises. It made boiler noises, the polite ticks of expansion. A soft run of condensed water in low spots, the occasional hollow ping at a hanger. The air was warm. In a niche, a clipboard hung from a nail. Trap check, with months in a grid, and initials beside nearly all of them. The last line carried a neat OK and a small smiling dot where the person had pressed their pencil a little longer than necessary. Back and clean, she walked the length of the mangle and put her hand to the flywheel. It moved by a whisper a few degrees only, enough to show her the machine's patience. She took a breath and turned it farther, and the blankets rolled. The return ticked. A soft clack answered from deep in the frame. No power, just mechanism following the respect of a hand. She stopped before the drum's weight argued. At the feed, the felt lifted and settled, as if it had inhaled, and then stayed polite. A soft thump sounded from the tower of chutes. In the soiled doorway, the bottom flap of one chute shifted and set itself. It was just air, or a last bit of lint admitting gravity. She walked over anyway. The label beside the chute mouth read 5E. On the floor, a corner of something white lay folded over itself. She brushed it up. It was a sheet bleached and thin and clean as ice. She turned it over. No tags. No tears. It smelled faintly like sunlight. Someone's careful laundry had missed the truck out. It felt wrong to put it in the cart. She took it to a folding table and opened it with the practiced flip of a person who knows how to make a large thing behave in small space. The template's blue arrows waited. Her hands remembered. You fold the bottom up, the side in, lift a corner to make a triangle, then tuck. The room seemed to help air moving at the right moment, the fabric's weight deciding to align. When she finished, the sheet lay with a single clean ridge at one end, the kind that makes a bed look like a promise. She didn't need to show anyone. The gesture satisfied something as deep as a keel. The time clock on the wall still had a stack of cards in its throat, most slotted names in faded ink. At the back of the deck sat one card stamped with the word Visitor. Someone had drawn a dot in its corner with a red pen at some long ago hour. She slid it into the clock out of habit and pulled the lever because her hand liked the motion. The machine gave a careful clunk. She drew the card back. The printed line read, 15. 0. The ink looked fresh because ink nearly always does on cardstock. She put the card back where she found it. Down the delivery corridor, the big door to the loading bay wore a map pinned to it with drawing tacks. Routes to the pavilions, a wing, orthopedics, West Maternity, rehab. Lines in different colors traced the tunnels like subway routes. Small notes in tidy block letters marked corners. Watch slope, mine drip, low beam. Someone had drawn a star next to a stretch labeled East Tunnel and written coffee on the way. She could see the walk in that line, warmer near the boiler, cooler at the bend by the chapel foundation. A person walks maps like that in their sleep after a few years to the beat of their own step. She gathered signage laminated cards that read, Clean Aria, Soiled Return, and a cracked plaque from an ironer that said caution, hot surface in the kind of font that tries to be patient. She unscrewed a dial face from a retired washer, because the museum liked round things with needles. When she turned, 4 towels sat on the nearest table, where there had been none. 2 white, 2 striped. They lay in a stack, square, their edges aligned in that unshowy way that means good work. She hadn't heard a cart. She hadn't brought them. The brain likes a trick. The room liked a routine. Between those two truths falls the gentle turning of a wheel. Her phone vibrated in her pocket with a text from facilities. Take what you need. Lock up if dark. She answered with a thumbs up, set the towels aside, and walked once more into the tunnel. Far down, a high whistling rose and faded the steam plant's old relief valve, finding a note and then letting it go. Near her knee, a small vent whispered, and then fell silent. The dotted line of air along the ceiling moved in tidy segments where its tape flags still held. She thought of metronomes in a practice room, each ticking at its own measure, until one hand clapped and they agreed. At the sewing room, spools of thread slept in a honeycomb of cubbies. Blues that would disappear into curtains, greens for scrubs, a single bright yellow that had lived on caution tags. A machine sat with its needle threaded and its presser foot raised. A length of binding waited at the edge of a curtain panel, pinned, the pins placed with the modest pride of someone who had learned to space them with their thumb as ruler. She stood a moment, then lowered the presser foot and raised it again, the way one does when acknowledging a job paused with intention. Evening drew the light down and made the machines look like sculptures. She packed the box with the dial, the signs, the instruction template for corners. She left the mangle for riggers with hoists and patience. Before she closed the door, she smoothed her palm along the feedboard one more time. Warm still, maybe from the day, maybe from work that a building does with air. On the way out, the bell above the dock door gave one small round note, not a ring, only the memory of arrival. She stepped onto the ramp and breathed river air. The vent stack let a ghost of steam unfurl and vanish. Lights from town made long carpeted reflections on the water. The laundry window showed nothing back but dim shapes and the color of dusk. Later, the museum put the ironer's dial on a wall and the folding template under glass. Visitors pressed their fingers to the pattern in the air, tracing arrows without touching the artifact. A small activity table held square cloths and a card that said, "Try a hospital corner." People did, and something about the angle of the tuck made them straighten their shoulders, as if a bed somewhere were about to be made right. A video ran of hands rolling the ironer with a crank and a patient drum taking a long breath and letting it out as a wide sheet. The old laundry kept its brick rectangle by the river until plans found it. On nights when fog crept from the water, walkers sometimes heard a quiet thump inside and the friendly shiver of a monorail trolley settling. If they peered through the high panes at the right hour, they might see nothing at all, or they might believe they saw a square of white on a table and the shadow of a hand smoothing it flat. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a test. It was a task, finishing itself the way some songs play to the end even after the room is empty. Story number 9. Street Aldens kept a television station in its basement once, a patient channel that broadcast to every room on coaxial veins. Channel 3. The window, said the bumper. A white serif on a deep blue field. Volunteers read poems. A pianist in the lobby played at 4. At 9, a calm graphic reminded the building to lower its voice. When the new medical center opened by the highway, most of the equipment stayed behind. The basement door gathered dust. The coax trunk that fed 5 towers of rooms went quiet mostly. Jules came to collect tapes and signage for the museum. They knew the old formats by the Italod, Smell Alone, U-Matic, Betacam, VHS, each with a different plastic note. The loading dock door sighed inward. A hand-lettered placard pointed the way. Media Services, with an arrow that did not entirely trust itself. Fluorescent fixtures overhead held a dim, pearly afterglow, the kind old phosphors sometimes give the air. The studio was 2 rooms and a corridor with cables like roots. In the control room, a switcher sat at attention. T2 bar poised halfway in its slide. A waveform monitor watched the bottom edge of reality. A rack of VCRs waited in their bays like quiet drawers. An on-air sign above the door had turned the color of old tomatoes. A small pilot light at its corner still nursed a coal of red. Through the window, the tiny set 2 armchairs and a ficus held their pose for no one. Jules clicked on a battery-powered work light and started with the shelves. A row of tape spines wore titles written in tidy felt tip. Morning Stretch with Myra. Music from the Lobby. Chapel Service. Sign. Off segment. Visiting Pets. Volunteer Fair. Good Night St. Aldens. December 1989. They smiled at that one and set it aside for transfer. A clipboard hung on a nail with a schedule grid, days blocked out. The last page, yellowed. At the bottom, a blank line held a small penciled note, written in an elegant hand. Please rewind kindness. It wears well. On the wall above the switcher, a program clock stopped at 20:59:57. Jules checked their phone. 20:27. The stopped hand felt like a promise waiting for a cue. They threaded a tape into a deck and powered it with a little inverter. The machine accepted the cassette and took a slow breath. The switcher's preview monitor, fed from the deck, warmed through the gray of sleeping phosphor into an image. Color bars, and then a slate. Chapel. Sign. Off. With leader numbers counting down in their backwards courtship 10, 9, 8. The studio air listened as if it had ears. The reel bloomed into soft images of corridors in evening light. A volunteer tucking a blanket with practiced corners, the lobby piano with no one at it but a pair of hands on keys anyway. A voice not a ghost's, just a person years ago who had the gift of speaking gently floated over the pictures. Quiet hours begin at 9. If you are awake, you are not alone. There is a nurse on every floor. There is a hand on every bell. The sign-off moved to the chapel. A hexagon of warm wood, a candle, the reflection of glass. Good night from Street Aldens. Rest comes. While it played, something odd and tidy happened. The on-air sign kissed up another degree of red, not bright, not insistent, only sure of itself. The little monitors that lined the rack, dead glass a moment before, found a wash of blue and lifted into a calm slate. Street Aldens Channel 3. In tiny script at the bottom of the slate, courtesy of Media Services. The patch bay between the switcher and the trunk showed no connection. Jules felt the sensation you get when a warm front passes through a room without moving any paper. They glanced through the studio door. The set was unchanged. A cue light above the camera lens that faced the chairs breathed once and went still. The camera itself was under a cloth. The cloth had gathered dust, the dust had gathered patience. Jules sat in the control chair because chairs remember where to put elbows, where to put hands. Their fingers found the intercom talkback. The switch had a soft detent, like a well-hinged book. They pressed it to make sure nothing from the deck would scream in anyone's ear. The ceiling speaker answered with a low, reciprocal hush, the sort of listening sound a good room makes. In the corridor, a cart held a stack of foam core boards with graphics. A loopy script that read "The Window," a blue card with white text that said "Visiting Hours," conclude 8:0 p.m., and the one Jules had come for. The good night card, midnight blue with a line of dotted stars, a tiny candle, a serif true. On the back, a piece of gaffer tape bore 2 words in pencil. Don't rush. They opened the rack door to find the signal path for the trunk amp. Many of the little lights didn't care to glow anymore. One did an LED marked loop. Beside it, a tag tied with string and a careful block hand. Leave on. Patients like to wake to birds. It shouldn't have been on. The building's mains were down. A UPS beneath it, older than some of the tapes, breathed a little as batteries sometimes do when they wish to be useful one more time. Jules touched the metal lightly and felt a feline warmth, unexpected and not demanding. At 20:58, by the phone on the desk, an old set with a row of white buttons that remembered lines the program clock above the switcher ticked. Jules heard it without seeing it move. A tiny click, and then the kind of quiet that is all readiness. The tape sign-off sequence reached the candle again. The building's baseboard lights, out beyond the studio and up into the wings, were not on. And yet in the preview monitor showing a feed from the corridor camera, there was a widening of pallor along the floor, as if the carpet had kept a memory of the trick. That was a trick of gain, of sensors waking in old cameras. Or it was a building that knew to dim itself by habit. The slate cut to an image of the night shift operator on a stool beside the switcher long ago. She wore a sweater the color of rain and a badge that said Mariel. She smiled toward the lens in a way that said, "I'm here. Go to sleep. This is the end of our broadcast day," she said. And it didn't sound like the end of anything. Channel 3 will return at 6 with the aquarium. The aquarium was a camera pointed at a fish tank in the lobby. Patients had used it like a window to a smaller ocean. Mariel folded her hands, as if to tuck the day in, and the slate went to color bars. A tiny chime in the ceiling played 2 notes in a stair-step, bing bong. It was the hospital's page tone, the one that asked everyone to listen politely, one last time. No voice followed. The on-air sign lowered its blush. The program clock eased past its second hand to the top of the hour and relaxed. On the bench in the studio, one chair had a cushion that seemed to remember a seated person, and then decided against it. Jules found the logbook on a shelf, a spiral-bound pad with a column for start, stop, content, issues, note. Many lines read neat things like 16:0 lobby piano no issues, and 21:0 sign. Off added caption for hearing, impaired. The last page had a half-written entry, 6:0 aquarium, and then the pen had left it aslant. Infantry halted. On the next line, the neat hand had printed in block letters, "We will keep the quiet for you." Maybe it was a note for the person who would come after. Maybe it was for the room. They boxed the tapes they had come for and slipped the goodnight board between 2 sheets of cardboard. As they taped the box closed, the intercom clicked by itself and whispered a texture, not language, the suggestion of someone leaning to say, "All right then." Jules put their palm on the switcher's TTO bar and eased it down. The preview and program monitors traded places like 2 people changing seats politely in a hall. Color bars came to the front, as if to wash the air. On the way out, the hallway outside media services widened into a lobby with a mural of a tree. A CRT mounted near the ceiling warmed from black to deep navy, then to a slow snow field of static that settled like a gentle rain, and then cleared. Channel 3's slate blue, calm, appeared for a count of 5 and then rested. Farther down the hall, another monitor woke, then closed its eyes. A security camera caught nothing but the gradient of dark to less dark, moving in time to a schedule no one had updated. Jules locked the door, the key turning with the click of a well-cut thought. They carried the box to the dock through air that felt freshly ironed. Outside, the sky had adopted the hospital's color bars in sky scale, bands of blue, pale, and great. A late saffron slipped under the roofs. In the reflection on the dock's window, a small red glint showed for a second where the on-air sign would be, and then it didn't. Weeks later, the museum's display featured a simple rig, the on-air sign wired to a gentle bulb, the good night board on a small easel, a loop of the sign-off playing on a crisp screen with soft volume. A button on the pedestal read "Play sign-off," Visitors pressed it at unlikely hours, at 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. The room hushed itself anyway. People stood and listened to Marielle's voice as if she had just stepped into the other room to fetch another tape. Children watched the aquarium feed, fish from a different lobby swimming in decade-old light. At Street Alden's, the coax stayed in the walls, a nervous system retired, but not erased. Some nights, the corridor CRTs sighed themselves awake and showed a breath of blue and then let go. If anyone had been there to see, they might have thought of the candle in the chapel, the page tone's polite 2 notes, the way a voice can lay a blanket over a floor better than any cloth. No one was there. The building kept its own company. Jules sometimes played the sign-off on a laptop at home when the hour got thin, and the world needed a smaller room. The 2 notes loved their stares. The voice named rest without insisting. The last image held 1 extra beat before the bars came up. That beat had a job, to tell the night it had been heard. Tonight the doors close softly. Old halls drift back into their hush. Windows keep only starlight. And here is simply your room. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe in for 4, hold for 5, out for 6, and let the quiet undo each knot. If the floor murmurs or the wind taps the glass, it's only the building remembering its favorite hours. Rest finds you easily now, carried to morning. Thank you for listening. Good night, and sleep well.